The Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will now come to order. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. We appreciate having you before us today, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening. And welcome to this hearing on oversight of the Federal Communications Commission. Today's hearing marks the first time in 28 years that the FCC has appeared before this subcommittee, having been reauthorized by Congress. So I'm delighted to welcome the recently reauthorized commission here today. This reauthorization effort reflects bipartisan, bicameral support of the FCC and the important work it carries out each day to enhance public safety, technologies, and alerts, strengthen our national security, increase broadband deployment, and protect consumers while fostering competition and innovation in the communications marketplace. I hope today also demonstrates the importance of being reauthorized as each of the commissioners articulates how that action benefits the organization. I know we can deliver the same bipartisan accomplishment for your colleagues at the NTIA. While the FCC is charged with many important tasks, one of the most critical roles it plays revolves around public safety, from working to ensure that alerting technologies warn the public of impending emergencies to aiding in the restoration of communications networks and services following emergencies. The FCC is responsible for making sure our communication systems are there when Americans are most in need of life-saving information. This work is furthered through the nation's 911 service platform, with this year being the 50th anniversary of the first 911 call. We here in Congress have been actively working with both the FCC and the NTIA to improve the country's 911 systems and facilitate the transition to next-gen 911 services. I'm looking forward to hearing more today about the FCC's work to advance public safety before, during, and after emergencies. The FCC has also worked closely with the subcommittee in our shared goal of promoting broadband access and closing the digital divide. We all agree on the importance of bringing the benefits of broadband to all Americans, and this is especially true in rural America. Rayburn's Act included a number of bipartisan provisions from members of this subcommittee and members of the full Energy and Commerce Committee that will help the FCC in removing federal barriers to broadband deployment, increasing the amount of available spectrum, and funding broadband. And just last week, in a hearing on rural broadband, we heard from a variety of stakeholders on the impact of that legislation. I look forward to hearing more today on how the FCC has begun to implement the legislation. I also look forward to hearing the Commission's recommendations on how we can improve connectivity for communities that are in desperate need of improvements to their education and healthcare services. It is this committee's primary role to conduct oversight of all the programs and policies overseen by the FCC, and I remain focused on our key priorities so we can focus the work of this commission. And at this time, I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Lance for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman. This is the most important responsibility we have on this subcommittee, and certainly we believe that it is incredibly important that the Commission, which does such fine work, is responsive to our concerns. I commend all of the commissioners for your work. It has been my honor to work with every member of the Commission. I want to continue to do so in as strong a capacity as possible. And moving forward, we have to make sure that we work in bipartisan cooperation on the issues so important to the American nation. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. At this time, I recognize the subcommittee's ranking member, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this very, very long overdue hearing. And thank you to the witnesses for finally, after 9 long months, coming before this committee once again. In the 9 months since our last hearing, the FCC has continued to expand its track record of anti-consumer, anti-small business, anti-innovation policies. It seems that at almost every opportunity, the Commission has chosen corporations over consumers and failed in its duty to uphold the public interest. In December of last year, the Commission voted to eliminate net neutrality protections that are supported by the vast majority of Americans from all sides of the political spectrum. Chairman Pai's comments regarding the quote-unquote chicken littles who were concerned about the repeal should take a look at the public opinion polls that show the vast majority of his own party is opposed to the Commission's action. These rules protected consumers and small businesses, as well as entrepreneurs and innovators. I'm happy to say that the Senate has already passed a resolution restoring these rules, and we hope that we have a vote on our own bipartisan resolution here in the House. The rest of the Commission's agenda has been no better. They have proposed gutting the Lifeline program, which is an essential communications tool for millions of Americans, including veterans and seniors. The Commission has made a series of decisions to encourage consolidation among broadcasters, from eliminating the main studio rule to reinstating the UHF discount, weakening the KidVid rules, and proposing to change the congressionally established national ownership cap. It seems that in each of these actions benefit broadcast corporations, and it leaves the public worse off. The chairman has claimed that he cares about rural broadband deployment, but the Commission, in its zeal not to burden major wireless carriers with reporting where they have wireless service deployed, imposed as part of Mobility Fund 2 a bizarre and onerous challenge process that requires rural providers to hire people to walk through cornfields and backyards trying to prove that communities don't have wireless service. And if those companies can't afford to send people out, the Commission will assume these communities are connected. Now tell me, how does that help the 24 million Americans without access to high-speed broadband? In the same vein, how does making changes to the CBRS ban to make it less accessible to rural wireless providers who are deploying broadband in hard-to-reach communities enhance the Commission and this committee's shared goal of closing the digital divide? Well, it doesn't. This Commission's reckless actions on broadband data services and copper retirement were so corporate-friendly that NTIA, the White House's advisor for telecommunications policy, recently said that they remain, quote, concerned, however, that streamlined regulatory requirements may place on federal departments and agencies that rely on services subject to discontinuance in the untenable position of losing access to critical national security and public safety communications functionality, unquote. How is the Commission putting the convenience of carriers above our nation's national security and public safety needs? And that's besides the impact that these policies have on schools, libraries, hospitals, small businesses, and competitors that also rely on these services. What about Americans' privacy? Senator Wyden's office recently found that wireless carriers have been sharing the real-time location data of hundreds of millions of cell phones with third parties without consent from their users. That included sharing information with law enforcement agencies that use this data to illicitly look up Americans' location data without a warrant or due process. And we don't even know the scope of this problem because the Commission was asleep at the wheel. I understand that the Commission is now investigating, but how were you so in the dark on an abuse that was a widespread industry practice? And what confidence can this committee have that the Commission will take appropriate enforcement action against carriers who have so recklessly shared our location data without our consent? Again and again, the Commission has failed in its obligations to uphold the public interest and has instead repeatedly sided with corporations over consumers. And in waiting 9 months to do this oversight hearing, this committee has been complicit in the Commission's action by turning a blind eye and being derelict in our responsibilities to provide oversight for this agency. I will just add that while I am pleased the Commission issued a hearing designation order for the Sinclair merger, and in doing so acknowledged the near universal concerns about Sinclair's honesty and candor, I'm extremely concerned that the President has waded into this issue. I hope, Chairman Pai, that you can assure us the President's tweet last night will not cause the Commission to change course or affect the proceedings of an administrative law judge. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and Mr. Walden, the chairman of the full committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank you for your leadership on these topics. Specifically, I want to thank you for highlighting the improving emergency alert and 911 services, as well as your outreach to the minority on the NTIA reauthorization. You know, we've reauthorized the FCC for the first time in, 28 years under the Rayburn Act. In fact, I think that's the last time you were here to testify before us, Mr. Chairman. The Commission's efforts in wildfire and hurricane response, its focus on emergency alerts and implementing improved call routing, location accuracy are key priorities for all of us. You know, we reauthorized the FCC for the first time in 2 decades. We appreciated the Commission's input on our work, and thanks to the hard work of everyone on the committee, we were able to incorporate provisions from 18 bipartisan bills that now form Rayburn Act, that is law. So here we do try to work together whenever we can on these issues, 18 bipartisan bills in the Rayburn Act, and I think we did 57 bills on opioids, virtually all of which were bipartisan. So I look forward to hearing about the FCC's progress in implementing this important law, such as the broadcast repack. You know, the Commission's been very busy doing good work on the repack. We provided an extra $1 billion and fixed some of the issues that were there to make sure that translators and FM radio stations could get their antennas moved, their equipment moved, so we can free up that spectrum. And I know the Commission, under your leadership and others, successfully pulled off the biggest reverse auction in history. You brought to our attention, Mr. Chairman, the issue involving the illegality of the funds that came to the Commission. You couldn't put them anywhere legally, even though your predecessor did. And so we fixed that. And I think that was important to take care of. I want to thank you for coming out to my district last month. And we traveled around. We saw a health clinic and what telehealth means. I want to commend the Commission for the decision to lift the cap on the rural health telemedicine piece. That made a huge and positive difference for our rural clinics when you added $171 million over the $400 million cap. You heard it firsthand when you were out there meeting with the clinic, and I appreciated the discussion we had with the broadcasters, the small ISPs, and I think you've got a taste for what the 7th or 8th largest congressional district in the country is, even though we never got out of one county, but we were there all day. And Commissioner O'Reilly and I have recently had conversations about the uphill challenge facing our radio industry, which I have some experience. My colleagues say I have a great voice for radio and a face for it too. They're not very nice people. Radio, as you know, was my original story and my father's as well, and I think it's a really important part of our country's framework and fabric of sharing information and entertainment. That fraternity of voices is sharing the same fate as newspapers, unfortunately, which never gained the benefits of cross-ownership relief under the Commission for some 15 years. Entities captured once again by regulations from another time. We seem trapped in this constant time warp that regulations of the 70s or the 1930s, for that matter, somehow work for the present day or beyond. And some obviously wanted to take us back to a regime of the 1930s. We'll discuss the changing media landscape today as well, another sector that edge providers are disrupting, which is great news. It's yet another example why I put the call out a year ago, and then a few months ago, inviting the CEOs of some of America's greatest innovative technology companies to please come here and share with us before this committee their concerns and recommendations on a wide range of topics. The rhetoric around these issues has become like watching the opening of an old television show waiting to get to the main programming. We sit here and listen to the same old falsehoods that we ripped away privacy and net neutrality protections, while the reality is all we've done is restore a bipartisan equilibrium and regulatory framework that had existed just 3 years ago. Little mom and pop startups kind of found their way through a light touch regulatory framework that we would now know those as, Facebook, Google, Netflix, you name it, all grew up in a light touch framework. Not with the 1930s way we regulated telephones. In this committee room, we do have the benefit of hearing our critics speak out loud, though unlike other corrosive voices that seek to destroy our daily discourse. As Chairman Pai knows all too well, be fearful if you're a conservative and let your views be known. I'm sorry for what you and your family's gone through. Whether you're on the right or the left, somewhere here we have to get back our humanity where we're not shouting at each other and threatening each other, but instead trying to work out our differences. We do that a lot in this committee, and we will continue to. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you for this hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, I recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The Federal Communications Commission is an independent agency created by and accountable to Congress. Congress gave the agency broad powers and a responsibility to protect consumers, advance competition, promote universal service at reasonable rates, and enhance public safety. In other words, to work in the public interest. As the FCC's Oversight Committee, it's our duty to ensure the Commission's actions advance those goals and hold the chairman and commissioners accountable when the agency does not. Unfortunately, the Republican majority of this committee has been unwilling to follow through on its promise to hold quarterly oversight hearings with the FCC. This is the first oversight hearing in 9 months and only the third this Congress. During that time, the Commission has repeatedly acted contrary to its core mission. In a series of partisan votes, the agency dismantled protections for consumers and initiated numerous proceedings designed to benefit big corporations to the detriment of working-class Americans and local communities. By far the most high-profile and controversial decision was the elimination of the FCC's net neutrality rules. Those safeguards protected consumers, protected small businesses, and protected free speech. Chairman Pai ignored the vast majority of the 24 million comments from individuals and businesses supporting net neutrality. It's not surprising that Chairman Pai's order faces massive consumer opposition. Public outrage from startup companies, working families, educators, healthcare professionals, veterans, and so many others at town halls and community centers have driven congressional action. In May, the Republican-controlled Senate passed legislation that would reinstate net neutrality. Ranking Member Doyle is now championing that legislation here in the House. And it's not too late to stand with the American people and restore net neutrality. And I urge Speaker Ryan to bring this legislation up for a vote and stand with the bipartisan members that have signed a petition to force one. Sadly, the FCC's disregard for consumers does not end there. At a time when other agencies are separating children from their families at our borders and violence at schools is far too commonplace, the Trump FCC wants to roll back rules that limit advertising to children and require stations to air educational programming for kids. And this doesn't make sense. If the agency was serious about focusing on consumers, it would want to help parents searching for quality educational programming and shield children, not make them easier targets for big business. In another example of siding with corporations over consumers, Chairman Pai's changes to the FCC's media ownership protections undermine competition, localism, and diverse viewpoints in favor of corporate consolidation. While the Commission rightfully acknowledged that Sinclair's proposed merger and related divestitures may violate the law, the rollback of the media ownership rules opens the door for the next Sinclair. Universal service, critical to the most vulnerable populations, also has been undermined under Chairman Pai's leadership. The FCC's proposal to revise the Lifeline program is a particularly egregious example. If adopted, this proposal could cut phone or internet service for approximately 8.3 million people. These are single mothers struggling to get by, veterans searching for jobs, and seniors on fixed incomes. They are at risk of being left behind. The FCC should be looking for ways to help these struggling participants in our economy and community and not just cut them off. And finally, while the Commission has worked to update the emergency alert system, advance Next Generation 911, and implement the Sandy Act, it has fallen short in making cybersecurity a priority. The agency has retreated from the efforts of previous administrations at a time when cyber criminals, foreign and domestic, are becoming more aggressive. Today's communications networks connect businesses, consumers, and government agencies, and these networks drive the modern economy. But those same networks provide a target for cyber attacks by criminal gangs and nation-states. As the agency charged with promoting public safety, the FCC should work with and encourage companies to develop best practices, address vulnerabilities, and prepare for cybersecurity attacks. Since the FCC is shirking its responsibility, Congress should be conducting more oversight in the future. So I want to thank the chairman and commissioners for appearing before us today and look forward to your testimony. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back, and that concludes the member opening statements. I remind all members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. And we are going to try to get through our opening statements before votes are called around 1:40. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give their opening statements. It will be followed by a round of questions from members. Our panel today includes Chairman Pai, Commissioner O'Reilly, Commissioner Carr, and Commissioner Rosenworcel. We appreciate that you are here and that your testimony was prepared and submitted on time. We will go in order of seniority, which is the tradition in this subcommittee, and I began with you today, Chairman Pai. You're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this hearing. I appreciate this chance to update you on the FCC's work. But before I do, I would like to thank this subcommittee for its vital assistance. The Rayburn Act of 2018, which originated in this subcommittee, contained a host of provisions that are already having a positive impact on the FCC's work. Perhaps most importantly, it corrected a technical problem involving deposits for spectrum auctions. With this fix in place, the FCC is moving forward aggressively to hold auctions and move a substantial amount of high-band spectrum into the commercial marketplace. This year, we are commencing the 28 gigahertz band auction, followed immediately by an auction of the 24 gigahertz band. In the second half of 2019, we intend to hold an auction of spectrum in the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands. Combined, these auctions will make almost 5 gigahertz of spectrum available and advance America's global leadership in 5G, the next generation of wireless connectivity. None of this would have been possible without the subcommittee's leadership. The FCC has also benefited from the subcommittee's support in carrying out our top priority, closing the digital divide. Yesterday, the FCC kicked off its Connect America Fund Phase 2 reverse auction, which will provide up to $2 billion over the next decade to bring fixed broadband to unserved areas across rural America. Earlier this year, we dedicated $500 million in additional funding to assist small carriers deploying rural broadband. We proposed almost $1 billion to restore and improve communications networks in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, following the devastating 2017 hurricane season. And we boosted telemedicine's promise by extending funding in our rural healthcare program by 43%, $171 million. Funding aside, we are also modernizing our rules, cutting through the regulatory red tape and making it easier for broadband providers to invest in next-generation networks. We have exempted small cells from the federal historic preservation and environmental review processes that were designed for traditional cell towers. We have updated our business data services regulations. We have reformed our network transition rules to make it easier for companies to upgrade from the fading networks of yesterday toward the resilient networks of tomorrow. We are making it easier and cheaper for providers, including competitive entrants, to get access to utility poles with one-touch make-ready rules, as proposed by our Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. And we have returned to the successful light-touch regulatory framework under which the Internet flourished in the United States from 1996 until 2015. I'm pleased to report that our policies to promote broadband deployment are working. According to a recent study in 2017, more commercial buildings in the United States added fiber connections than in any year since at least 2004. And according to figures released just today, it appears that broadband network investment in the United States increased by between $1.5 billion and $3 billion in 2017, reversing the declines that occurred during the last 2 years of the prior administration. This increased investment is having a tangible and positive impact on American consumers. I'll give you just one example. VTEL is a small internet service provider based in Springfield, Vermont. The company reported recently that because of recent FCC policies, it, quote, committed $4 million to purchase equipment and services to upgrade its LTE core to enable voice roaming and Wi-Fi calling to all our Vermont rural subscribers, and to simultaneously begin rolling out faster mobile broadband that will start our transition to 5G. VTEL concludes, and I quote again, "It is quite optimistic about the future, and the current FCC is a significant reason for our optimism." In short, we are on the right track, and I'm confident that we will continue to see more positive results in the months ahead as more of our policies take hold. I'm also pleased by the amount of bipartisan cooperation we have seen at the FCC. This year, for example, fewer than 6%, or 1 in 16, of our over 100 votes have been party line. Of course, there will be times when we disagree, but my hope is that the debate will be based on facts, consistent with law, and grounded in reality. I'll close on a personal note. I love this agency. I have worked at the FCC for most of the past 11 years, first as a staffer and then as an appointee. It has been a tremendous honor to lead this commission over the last 18 months. A major reason why is because I get to work alongside and have gotten to know the FCC's fantastic staff, those who race toward hurricane-hit areas to help, those who strive to make technologies available to Americans with disabilities, those who devote countless hours to representing our country abroad, and more. And as for me, the issues I have faced are challenging. The decisions I've made haven't always been easy. But so long as I have the privilege of serving as the chairman of the FCC, I'm going to find the facts, I'm going to follow the law, and I'm going to call them like I see them. Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, members of the subcommittee, thank you once again for holding this hearing. I look forward to answering your questions and to continuing to work with you and your staffs in the time to come.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. O'Reilly, you're recognized.
Thank you. My thanks to Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, and the members of the subcommittee for the honor to engage with you on so many important communications issues. At the outset, I'd like to thank Representatives Lance, Tonko, and Collins and their co-sponsors, many on the subcommittee, and the chairman and ranking member for their leadership on the Pirate Act. Under Chairman Pai's leadership, the Commission has made great strides in terminating unlawful pirate radio activity. But without additional tools provided by Congress, we can only go so far to eliminate this harmful practice. Today, I'd like to highlight a few critical issues that have been a focus of mine. First, I firmly believe that the ongoing problem of 911 fee diversion by certain states and territories must end once and for all. Such diversion, beyond deceiving ratepayers, has real consequences for the public safety community and the American people in need of critical emergency assistance at some of the darkest moments in their lives. The Commission's 9th annual report to this committee, which relied on self-reporting by states and territories, showed 5 states diverted almost $130 million away from 911 enhancements and towards other unrelated purposes. Moreover, 7 states and territories figured out that instead of being labeled a diverter, they would rather just not submit the necessary paperwork. Take New York, a previously self-admitted diverter, which failed to respond to the Commission's data collection inquiries, but sufficient public record information supported a finding that it is a substantial diverter of funds for non-public safety purposes. There is some good news to report in that several states and territories have clarified their reported diversion or made commitments to prevent a reoccurrence. These include Illinois, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Puerto Rico. However, not every state or territory has been a success story. Accordingly, I suggest additional federal action, such as legislation proposed by Representatives Collins, Eshoo, and Lance, is necessary to address recalcitrant states like New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Guam. Identifying and shaming these states has not adequately worked. Second, the Commission is focused on taking every necessary and appropriate step to provide all Americans the opportunity to access broadband services. At the same time, the Commission's efforts should be examined in parallel with programs by other federal agencies. Congress recently allocated, as part of last year's Consolidated Appropriation Act 2018, an additional $600 million for a new broadband pilot program to be administered by the Rural Utilities Service, or RUS, and an additional broadband funding is being considered as part of the Senate and House Farm Bills. While efforts to provide RUS with new federal money are commendable, there is a potential for certain problems to arise. In particular, there is a significant possibility that the RUS programming could be used to subsidize areas that already have broadband or fund providers in competition with those that currently receive FCC subsidies or may have build-out plans that require them to provide service in the future. Additionally, the RUS program could be used to allow providers to serve favored institutions without serving more costly nearby areas. Fundamentally, federal funding should be targeted to addressing the 14 million plus Americans without any broadband today. I would humbly suggest that only the proper direction from the right leadership, such as this subcommittee, can prevent a bad outcome. As Congress concludes the Farm Bill this fall, I hope you will consider additional safeguards, including strict prohibitions on duplication with other existing programs, alignment of speed requirements, and a focus on the truly unserved. Lastly, turning to spectrum policy, the Commission has been hard at work ensuring that sufficient spectrum is available for next-generation wireless services. I recognized years ago that there was a need for a solid mid-band play for wireless carriers to offer 5G services both domestically and internationally. The 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, or C-band downlink, is an attractive option for this purpose, as it provides significant contiguous spectrum, and the largest satellite operators are receptive to reducing their spectrum footprint using a market-based spectrum reallocation approach. I also agree with Representatives Guthrie and Matsui, who recently noted that the Commission that the 6 gigahertz band is a necessary ingredient to address the need for more unlicensed spectrum and must be part of our final rules. With that, I want to thank the subcommittee for holding this hearing, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Carr, you're recognized. Microphone, please.
Try that again. Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify. I've had the honor of working with you and your staffs as a commissioner for nearly a year. It's been a tremendously rewarding and productive time. I'm proud of the work the agency has accomplished, and I want to commend the subcommittee on its own notable achievements. From identifying additional spectrum in the Ray-Bombs Act and enhancing public safety through the Sandy Act, to encouraging broadband deployment, including through the Precision Ag Act. At the FCC, I've focused on work we can do to help bring more broadband to more Americans. This has meant working closely with my colleagues at the Commission, but it's also meant spending time outside of DC to see firsthand how our policies impact communities across the country. Over the past 11 months, I've visited 17 states. I've benefited from perspectives gained on the road, whether at a town hall in Chelsea, Michigan, a round table in Stanton, Nebraska, or at the kitchen table of a family that wanted better and faster broadband. I spent time with the construction crews that are doing the hard, often gritty work that goes into deploying broadband networks. In fact, in Arcadia, Indiana, Congresswoman Susan Brooks introduced me to two Hoosiers, Mark and Scott. They're brothers. They run a small fixed wireless provider. They're a scrappy bunch, having climbed everything from barns to grain elevators to attach the antennas needed to bring broadband to Indiana's farmlands. I've seen similar efforts in communities across the country, and it only underscores why the work of this subcommittee and the FCC is so important. We want every community to get a fair shot at next-generation connectivity. 1 year ago, I noted the challenge we faced in extending American leadership in wireless as we move from 4G to 5G networks. I testified about the need for the FCC to focus on two things, spectrum and infrastructure. The Commission has made substantial progress on both. I want to focus this afternoon on the second part, on infrastructure. I appreciate that Chairman Pai asked me to lead the FCC's efforts on wireless infrastructure. We've already taken several steps to ensure our regulatory structures are 5G ready. As you know, 5G networks are going to look very different than the 3G and 4G deployments of the past. And the regulatory framework that worked for 100-foot towers won't work for new small cell deployments. So we're working to modernize our approach. In March, we exempted small cells from certain federal review procedures designed for those large 100-foot towers. This one step is expected to cut about 30% of the total cost of deploying small cells. This reform can help flip the business case for thousands of communities, particularly in rural areas that might otherwise miss out on next-gen connectivity. And one place where increased deployment will pay off is in healthcare. For years, the FCC has been supporting broadband deployment to healthcare facilities. But there's a new trend in telehealth. It's towards connected care everywhere. The delivery of high-tech, high-quality care is no longer limited to the confines of connected brick-and-mortar facilities. With remote patient monitoring and mobile health applications, we now have the technology to deliver health care directly to patients, regardless of where they're located. I saw this 2 weeks ago in the Mississippi Delta, which is ground zero for the country's diabetes epidemic. The Delta is also a place where connected care is already making a difference. It's where I met Miss Annie. She noticed the first signs of diabetes when she woke up one morning with blurred vision. After seeing little progress with traditional care options, she signed up for a remote patient monitoring program. She showed me the iPad and the Bluetooth-enabled blood glucose monitor that she uses to track her care on a daily basis. She can check her blood sugar levels, and an app gives her instant feedback, including the steps she can take that day to stay healthy. With this technology, Miss Annie's A1C levels have gone down, and she says she's never felt better. And research backs up Miss Annie's results, showing significant cost savings and improved outcomes with connected care. So we should align public policy in support of this movement in telehealth. That's why I'm glad Chairman Pai asked me to lead the FCC's new telehealth initiative, which we'll consider at our August meeting. The Connected Care Pilot Program aims to provide up to $100 million to support connected care deployments focused on low-income patients. I look forward to working with all stakeholders as we seek comment on establishing the program. And Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, members of the committee, thank you again for holding this hearing. I welcome your questions.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Rosen-Worcel, you're recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, and the other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I believe the future belongs to the connected. No matter who you are or where you live in this country, you need access to modern communications to have a fair shot at 21st century success. Clearing the way for this connected future should be at the heart of everything we do at the Federal Communications Commission. It has been 9 months to the day since we last appeared before you for an oversight hearing. 9 months is a long time. It's the equivalent of a school year. So let me offer the equivalent of a quick year-end report. Too many Americans still lack access to broadband. Let me put a number on it. Right now, 24 million Americans do not have access to high-speed service. That's not acceptable. We need to do better. Too often during the last 9 months, the agency acted at the behest of corporate forces that surround it, shortchanging the American people. You can see that clearly with our rollback of net neutrality. You see it, too, with our efforts to foster the deployment of new networks, but failure to fully engage those who need a voice in our policies, the cities and towns that should be our partner in the process, the tribal communities that are entitled to government consultation, and the Department of Commerce, which just last week expressed concern about how our rush to reform could harm national security and public safety services. Likewise, you see it in proposed reforms that undermine our Lifeline program and the populations that rely on it, including those served by domestic violence shelters, military veterans, homeless youth, and the residents of Puerto Rico who are still recovering from a harrowing storm and grave humanitarian crisis. Too often, our procedures fall short of what good governance requires. Our mapping practices for broadband do not accurately reflect the state of connectivity on the ground. Our claim that the agency suffered a distributed denial of service attack following John Oliver's report on our net neutrality plans is just not credible. In the meantime, the agency has ignored the fact that this public docket is flooded with fraud, including 500,000 comments from Russia and 2 million individuals with stolen identities. I believe these things need to be fixed. So many people think that Washington is rigged against them. It saddens me when on too many occasions during the last 9 months, this agency proved them right. But good report cards do not only look to the past, they also offer an eye to the future, and take on what is possible. I believe at this table, there is a desire to extend the reach of broadband service, lead the world in 5G wireless deployment, and bring the opportunities of the digital age to more people in more places. I see this same desire everywhere I go. In the last few weeks, I've been in rural New Mexico and urban New York. In both places, I visited schools with students who lack broadband at home and as a result, struggle with nightly schoolwork. There are 12 million children in every state across the country with this problem. They fall into a homework gap that is the cruelest part of our digital divide. But I also saw that these communities are trying to address this gap so that every student has a decent chance at digital age success. They're experimenting with connected school buses. They're looking at loaning out hotspots in library, and they are exploring public Wi-Fi in their communities. They deserve our support and a plan to address the homework gap so that no child is left offline. I still believe it is within our capability to produce one. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not mention the agency's recent decision regarding Sinclair Broadcasting. When I last appeared before you 9 months ago, I alone expressed concern about how the agency had bent and twisted so many of its media policies to serve the business plans of this one company. This changed last week when the agency adopted an order designating the proposed Sinclair Tribune transaction for hearing. I want to thank my colleagues and the chairman in particular for the effort to reach consensus on this matter. Let me close by saying thank you for having me at this hearing, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
I thank each of you for your testimony, and we're now going to move into our questions, and I'm going to begin and recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. And Chairman Pai, I'm going to come to you. Public safety is something that we're focused on in the emergency alerts and our 911 systems. As you know, our Ranking Member Pallone's Sandy Act was included in the Ray Bombs Act, and it's a good, solid bipartisan initiative to help with Wi-Fi resources, bringing those to bear during an emergency. And while the EAS system is typically the primary tool, we saw the resiliency of cellular infrastructure in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey and the widespread use of the WIA alerts. And how will the addition of opening up Wi-Fi access points in times of emergency, in addition to carrier location information and other inputs, help a device create more precise location information to better enable our first responders to reach those that are in need of that emergency help?
Thank you, Chairman Blackburn, for the question, and to you and to Ranking Member Pallone for your leadership on that legislation. One of the most critical elements of information that a first responder needs when a 911 call is placed is, where is the caller? And I think that the addition of more Wi-Fi access points could help introduce even more detailed, granular information about where that caller is. In combination with GPS information and cellular information, Wi-Fi access points can give a more textured view to 911 call centers and help them pinpoint exactly where somebody is to be able to dispatch help quicker. Additionally, I think it's interesting that a lot of companies are thinking very forward, as is the subcommittee. For example, Apple recently announced in iOS 12 that it would incorporate the technology from a small startup called Rapid SOS. And one of my predecessors, Chairman Dennis Patrick, has talked about the fact that this technology could use things like Wi-Fi access points and other information to more accurately and quickly target people who are in a situation of need.
And then looking at states and localities using the WIA system, you think this is going to help?
Absolutely. I think
encourage that? I just, you know, when you think about needing that help that quickly, and responders who are working so diligently to get resources to people, one of the things is we've worked on this issue, and Ms. Brooks has worked on it some too with the Next Gen 911, is making certain that it is more reliable and more widely used. So,
yeah. Absolutely. I'll give you one quick example of why that is so. Recently, I visited the D.C. Office of Communications that handles 911 calls that are coming to the district, and Karima Holmes, the director, told me that every year the District of Columbia gets approximately 10,000 emergency calls that are more properly routed to Maryland, and vice versa. Maryland gets 10,000 calls that are more properly routed to the district because the caller is very near that border. Imagine ubiquitous Wi-Fi access points that could allow emergency responders to know when they receive that call in the 911 call center, okay, we are getting a call from the district. We don't waste precious seconds trying to figure out exactly which jurisdiction needs to get that call. That could really save lives in a pinch.
Yeah. Commissioner Rosenworcel, I want to come to you on something. As you know, I've worked for years on the privacy issue, and I assume that you saw the letters that we sent to Location Smart and Securus and 3C Interactive inquiring about the reports of the unauthorized disclosure of wireless subscribers' real-time location information, and I'm pleased that you all are investigating this as well, as we all are concerned about protecting consumer privacy. And on this broader topic, last night I received a letter from our friends at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, and to quote from the letter, it says, "It is clear that the FCC has the ability to enact internet privacy rules. The FCC has the authority to regulate companies such as Facebook and Google through ancillary jurisdiction." Do you agree with that assertion?
No, I don't agree with that assertion.
Okay. Do you believe that Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act or any other provision gives the authority to the FCC to also regulate edge providers?
I do not believe it clearly gives us that authority, no.
You do not. Thank you. Gentlelady yields back, and I yield back, and I recognize Mr. Doyle for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome back. It's good to see all of you. I want to talk a little bit about rural broadband. The Commission received a letter on July 23rd from a group of 182 fixed wireless providers regarding the CBRS ban. And they noted that, and I quote, "Without census tract-sized licenses, we will have virtually no ability to acquire protected spectrum in this band. That would be an intolerable outcome that would harm our rural broadband businesses and inhibit our ability to grow. But worse, it would harm the millions of consumers for whom mid-band spectrum is the key to high-speed fixed broadband access." I would note that, Chairman Pai, you tweeted that your parents are served by Wave Wireless, and Commissioner Carr, in your testimony, you referred to the good work of On-Ramp Indiana that serves Ms. Brooks' district. Both of these companies were part of the 182 companies that sent you that letter. So I'd like to ask each of the commissioners, and this is just a simple yes or no question, will you commit to maintaining census tract licenses in this band?
Ranking Member Doyle, I've delegated this issue to Commissioner O'Reilly. He's recently provided a lot of analysis on this question, so I don't want to presuppose what direction he wants to recommend for the full commission.
But as chair of the commission, would you commit to having census tract size licenses?
Ranking Member Doyle, we don't want to presuppose the result. We're still studying the issue, and I'm looking at the issue along with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Okay, Commissioner O'Reilly, he's dumped it on you, so what do you say?
Sure. No.
You do not support doing it. I like that direct answer. I don't agree with it, but I like it. Yes, Commissioner Carr?
I haven't made my decision up yet on how to cast a vote in this proceeding.
Thank you.
Yes, we're going to need smaller license sizes if we want wireless providers to serve rural America with this band.
So one yes, one undecided, one no, and one abstention, or
We're still looking at the issue, Congressman.
undecided?
Yeah, we haven't reached the end point. We're still in the 6th or 7th inning.
Okay. Chairman Pai, I mentioned in my opening statement that many stakeholders, including the federal government, are very concerned about your plans regarding the discontinuance of service and changes to the BDS market could place our national security and public safety operations in an untenable position. Are you concerned that in addition to the potential loss of service that some BDS customers are telling us that they've had their bills increased by 175%, I'm kind of concerned that it's not only putting the carrier's interest over the public's, but it's endangering our public safety, our national security, and leading to huge rate increases for people to have this service. How do you respond to that? What was that?
Sorry, Congressman. Sorry, I was thrown off there.
That was a strange, is that a phone ring?
It is
I'm sorry,
Mr.
Mr.
Olson trying to play with new technology in the Communications and Technology Committee.
Guilty as
The
charged.
gentleman apologizes, it is accepted, and Mr. Doyle, you're reclaiming your time.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Would you address some of the concerns that we're hearing about the BDS market?
Sure, and I will try to address those in turn. So with respect to NTIA, we certainly welcome the submission. That's part of the reason why we have an open notice and comment process to take public input. If you look at the overall tenor of the NTIA letter, it's quite supportive of our approach. Nonetheless, we do want to take those concerns into account. Secondly, with respect to BDS overall, the price increases you described are precisely the reason why it was important to us in the BDS order last year to preserve FCC authority under Section 201 and 202, as well as the ability of private companies to complain directly to the FCC under Section 208. We will adjudicate any complaints we get about price discrimination that might be in violation of our rules. Thirdly, if you look at the overall gist of our BDS approach, the notion is that price regulation deters fiber deployment, and it does that for two different reasons. Number one, if you're a owner of that infrastructure and there's heavy price regulation, you would have less of incentive to build out additional infrastructure. Why would you? It's price regulated. Similarly, if you're a competitive entrant relying on that infrastructure, you'd be less likely to build out infrastructure of your own. Why would you? The FCC has put a finger on the scale in terms of price regulation. Our goal is to preserve that ability of competitive entrants to complain to the FCC about unreasonable charges, while also promoting an incentive to get more fiber out. And the results speaks for themselves. If you looked at my opening statement, for the first time, over 50% of mid and large-sized commercial buildings in the United States are connected with fiber. We want every one of those buildings to be connected with fiber. And we think that this light-touch, market-based approach that started with Chairman Kennard back in the late 1990s is the right way to go.
Let me ask you one last question, Chairman Pai. You're aware of Senator Wyden's letter to the FCC regarding the real-time location data and the company Securus Technologies.
Yes.
And on May 18th, Senator Wyden called on you to recuse yourself from the investigation based on your past work representing Securus. Have you recused yourself?
I have not, in consultation with the Office of General Counsel.
And that was my next question. Did you get an opinion from the FCC Ethics Office as to whether or not you should recuse yourself?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you.
Time has expired. Mr. Walden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate, again, commissioners being here. And I believe we've sent a letter as well to the companies regarding the same issue. Obviously, we all care about privacy and about data location issues, something we've been pursuing for some time. Chairman Pai, let's switch to the C-band. It's our understanding that national public radio, commercial broadcasters, and cable companies depend on it for content distribution to about 100 million households. That's obviously a lot of people in every state, probably every congressional district. But one of the challenges to ensure non-interference with C-band downlinks is to know the exact location of hundreds and potentially thousands of unregistered receive-only Earth stations. What's the Commission doing to identify the location of these Earth stations and ensure they're protected from potential harmful interference? And what steps is the Commission taking to balance these two goals of ensuring we win the race to 5G, which requires more mid-band spectrum, and the protection of the downlink the broadcasters and cable companies depend upon?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Walden, and I think you've put your finger on the two goals that we need to pair in this proceeding. And we've tried to address the concern you have identified about the need to figure out where these stations are in a few different ways. For example, we have reduced the fees that are required to file some of these reports. Additionally, we've extended the time frame by 90 days, and so I believe October 17th now is when the deadline is for reporting. In addition to that, we recognize that some of these entities are smaller. They might not have the resources to compile a full study that is required traditionally under FCC rules, and so it was important to me to streamline that process to allow them to get as much information as they can into the record. At the end of the day, we are confident that steps like these will enable us to get a robust level of participation from those entities and enable us thereafter to make a fully informed decision about the appropriate disposition of the C-band.
All right, thank you. As you've heard from many members on both sides of the aisle up here, we need to do more as a country to connect each other with high-speed data and broadband connections. So what can you tell us, Chairman, about the work the FCC is doing today to close this digital divide? What should we look forward to going forward? And what do you need from us?
Chairman Walden, I appreciate the question. We are doing a lot, and I don't want to use the remainder of your time, but what I will say is with the two critical tools in the toolbox that we have, that is modernization of our regulations and the wiser distribution of universal service funding, we are making major steps towards closing the digital divide. I mean, the $2 billion fixed broadband program that just started yesterday, the reverse auction for Connect America Fund Phase 2, the $4.5 billion Mobility Fund Phase 2 that will start next year. And some of the initiatives that may appear smaller, but I can tell you when I'm on the ground in places like Pendleton, Oregon, and Oldsmar, Florida, and McClure, Ohio, they're not small. Telemedicine. This is one of the things that American people just understand, especially in rural communities where it's hard to attract a specialist, like my parents, who formerly were customers of Wave Wireless. It's very difficult in some cases to get specialists. The only way that some of these folks in rural communities will get adequate health care is through telemedicine. And you saw the response for yourself, as did I, at Marisol Health Clinic in Oregon, when they heard the news that we were proposing to increase by 43% the budget for the rural health care program. I mean, if you remember, they broke out into applause because they recognized that this is a lifeline, quite literally, for some of these communities. And Pendleton and Hermiston are big cities in your district. There are a lot of smaller towns that will never see a specialist. And I'm really proud of the steps we've taken on the funding side to close the digital divide. In terms of modernization, too, we've done a lot to promote more infrastructure in rural areas, making it easier to build the towers, for example, in rural areas, or lay fiber in cases where there might not be a business case for deployment. And I think often about some of the visits I've had, including your district. I popped into Baker City, Oregon, where GeoNet told me that some of the steps we are taking in terms of making it easier to gain access to poles or get more spectrum, those are the tools that are necessary for the smaller companies in particular, the ones that don't make the headlines, that nobody knows about. Those are the things that will help them close the digital divide.
And 5G, as it rolls out, what do we need to be doing there?
I think for us, at least, spectrum and infrastructure are the critical inputs with respect to spectrum. I outlined some of the steps we are taking to move very quickly, and having just come from a couple of conferences where I can tell you that my counterparts abroad are both envious and interested about how quickly we're moving on 5G. The United States is in the lead in terms of spectrum leadership. As far as infrastructure goes, Commissioner Carr has done an able job in leading our wireless infrastructure efforts. We need to think nimbly and progressively about how to modernize our regulations. The world of a few very sparsely populated cell towers is fading away. The era of the small cell, hundreds of thousands of small cells being deployed, is almost here. And so our regulatory approach needs to be as nimble as the industry that we're seeking to regulate.
My time's expired, Madam Chair. Thank you for having this hearing. And to all the commissioners, thank you for your participation in council.
Gentleman yields back. For everyone's awareness, votes have been called. Mr. Pallone is going to ask his questions. Then I will move to recess the subcommittee until we return from votes. Mr. Pallone, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chairman Pai, I was glad to see the commission vote to send the Sinclair Tribune transaction to an administrative law judge for review despite the wishes of the president. And I've long had serious concerns about this merger, including the sham agreements Sinclair used to try and hide the scope of this transaction. That's why Ranking Member Doyle and I wrote to the GAO 2 weeks ago, asking them to review how these sham agreements affect localism, diversity, and competition. However, last night, President Trump tweeted, and I quote, "So sad and unfair that the FCC wouldn't approve the Sinclair broadcast merger with Tribune. This would have been a great and much-needed conservative voice for and of the people. Liberal fake news NBC and Comcast gets approved, much bigger, but not Sinclair. Disgraceful." End of quote. And the only thing that I find disgraceful is that the president is still trying to undermine the integrity of dedicated journalists while blatantly trying to enrich his friends and amplify his message at the expense of local news across the country. So let me just ask you, yes or no, we're running out of time. If I can ask each of the panel, do you agree with the president's tweet, yes or no? We'll start with the chairman.
Congressman, I stand by our decision.
Okay.
Congressman, that issue's been referred. I have to not answer that question.
You don't want to answer. Okay. Mr. Carr?
Congressman, thank you. I think the hearing designation order lays out the facts and the law as applied in our view.
All right. And Commissioner Rosenberg?
I do not agree with that
All right. Now, let me ask these questions of Chairman Pai. I know we only have 3 minutes or so. Given the President's politicization of the Sinclair merger, will you commit to ensuring that a comprehensive and thorough review is conducted by the ALJ, insulated from the President or anyone purporting to speak on his behalf? Yes or no?
Congressman, we've already issued the hearing designation order, and my understanding is that it is now within the purview of the administrative law judge under our rules.
But, I mean, you're going to ensure that a comprehensive and thorough review is conducted by ALJ?
Consistent with the HDO, those are the issues that have been referred to the ALJ, yes.
Okay. If the President or anyone in the White House discusses or has discussed the Sinclair Tribune merger with you or anyone at the FCC, will you commit to disclosing that in the public docket, yes or no?
Yes, except, Congressman, we have ex parte rules because this is now a restricted proceeding. We are limited in what information we can receive and what we can put on the record. But consistent with our restricted ex parte rules, we would be happy to accommodate to the extent we can.
Yes, basically. All right. The President cites the need for a conservative voice. That's the thing that's most disconcerting to me because I don't believe the FCC is supposed to make decisions based on what's conservative or liberal or Democrat or Republican or just be independent of the President. So does the FCC consider conservative or liberal viewpoints as part of its merger review? In other words, do you care whether it's a conservative voice or not?
Congressman, I stick with the answer I gave on November 30th, 2011, when I testified as a nominee. For every transaction that is before me, I will look at the facts, I will apply the law, and I will reach the judgment that is in the public interest. That is nothing more, nothing less.
I would just hope that we're not looking at this from an ideological point of view, which the President is trying to achieve. The hearing designation order that the FCC unanimously voted to approve notes that Sinclair may have engaged in misrepresentations or a lack of candor in its statements to the Commission about the merger. Whether a licensee is lying to the Commission is a serious allegation, and stations have had their license revoked for making misrepresentations to the FCC. So again, to you, Chairman Pai, without commenting on the current proceeding, I'm not asking you to do that, will the Commission conduct a factual inquiry into Sinclair's lack of candor regarding the licenses it currently holds, either now or at the time of the renewal, yes or no?
Congressman, we've referred certain issues to the ALJ in the HDO. I can't comment under advice of our general counsel on anything having to do with that, and I view your question as being inextricably linked to some of the issues that we referred to the ALJ.
Okay, so the answer is no. Commissioner Rosenzweig, would you like to add anything on that?
Well, I would point out that we have raised issues about the candor of this company before the FCC, the misrepresentations they made in the context of this transaction, and I think those are serious issues of character qualification under Title III of our statute, and to the extent that they have been identified as a problem here, we should be open to investigation in other contexts as well.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The committee stands in recess.
Yes, good to see you. How are you?
Just happened to be here in council. Radio station.
How are you? You remember Brooke, right? Yes, good to see you. I gotta say, I just... Thank you. You're beating me. I'm sorry it took so long. No.
Yeah, well, that was really meaningful.
How are you doing?
I still don't know.
If invited, if my schedule allows, in the future,
on the whole thing.
How you doing? Very good. Doing fine. Thank you. I'm having a great time.
I'm always so stunned when I see you in a suit.
How do we just two though? It's one day. So we're getting.
Yeah. Step by step.
It's still the case that
Okay. It's a nice to start.
Yeah.
Hopefully they'll get to 2 points and then I think it's something it's not good. Not all the
My daughter.
points.
That's not all. That's it.
So,
That's an
how's everything else?
everything else is great.
Excellent.
You having a good summer?
It's been a busy summer.
You haven't gotten away?
No. I'm lucky I'll get away until after 3 or 5. So, it's getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. Well, I mean, at some point you just need to. So, we're at that point. So.
Good luck.
Committee will come to order. Mr. Lynch, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner O'Reilly, in order to be the first in the world to deploy 5G, we need to set an aggressive schedule of auctions to make more low and mid and high band spectrum commercially available. That is why Ranking Member Doyle and I have introduced the Airwaves Act, which does just that. However, it is my understanding that no matter how ambitious we are in setting a schedule, there may be certain technological impediments to auctioning off spectrum in a timely fashion. Is the FCC's auction IT out of date? And if so, what effect does that have on the Commission's ability to keep up with the rest of the world in bringing more spectrum to market?
Thank you for the question. I don't know if I would use the word out of date or just not as advanced as it should be. It has limitations, and to the question that Congressman Doyle raised,
yes,
regarding 3.5,
yes,
part of the reason why I had to answer no in terms of census tracts is because it was not going to be an actual auction that we were supposedly going to conduct under census tracts. It was actually going to be a sealed bid for 74,000 licenses times 7, or 500,000 licenses, and that we were not capable of running with our software. And it gets to the question, to your point, number of bands people have asked for 24, 28, 37, 39, 47 all at once. We weren't and don't have the capability to run all of those at once. The chairman's done yeoman's job of scheduling spectrum, and I appreciate the work he's done. In 2 bands we're going to do this fall and 3 next fall. That's great. But in terms of what we're capable of doing with auction software, it should be much more advanced for the money that we're spending on it.
Thank you. Do other members of the Commission have thoughts on this? Commissioner Rosenworcel.
We all know that we want to lead the world in the wireless economy and in 5G. And I think it's a shame if our bureaucratic auction software doesn't allow us to do that. If that's a problem, we need to commit time, energy, and resources to fixing it. We shouldn't allow that to be an impediment.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman?
I couldn't agree more with Commissioner Rosenworcel. That's why a few months ago I testified before the House and the Senate and asked for resources specifically devoted in part toward upgrading our IT infrastructure to allow us to do much more quickly with this software.
Right. Thank you. Chairman Pai, the Commission has had a petition from a New Jersey-based company, PDV Wireless, and Enterprise Wireless Alliance, before the Commission since the fall of 2014. Petition asks that the Commission to update the rules around the lower 900 megahertz band to support broadband. To your credit, you put the item out as an NOI last August. I, of course, take no position on the merits of that. That is for the Commission to decide. But as we approach the 1-year mark since the NOI, can you, Mr. Chairman, commit to moving the item to notice of proposed rulemaking soon?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I can say that I am working with our staff, and we are drafting a notice of proposed rulemaking to follow up on the NOI that you have inquired about.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, from a global competitiveness perspective, we need to ensure that the U.S. wins the race to 5G. We can all agree on that. However, at the same time, we need to ensure we are bringing connectivity to rural America as well. We have made great strides, but clearly more needs to be done. The Airwaves Act includes a rural dividend, setting aside 10% of proceeds from future spectrum auctions to deploy wireless in unserved and underserved, often rural areas. If this rural dividend were in place for the last 2 auctions, over $6 billion would be used to fund rural deployment. And this funding would not come from taxpayers or be added to consumers' telephone bills. Do you agree that this provides a creative solution to the challenges of deploying rural broadband?
Congressman, I commend you for your leadership on that issue. I agree with you 100%, so much so that in September of 2016, I gave a speech in which I outlined my agreement with the rural dividend proposal. Redirecting that money to rural broadband could have a major impact on closing that digital divide.
Thank you. I want to continue to work with all members of the Commission. I commend you for your public service. I apologize for leaving. Congresswoman Brooks and I are on the Ethics Committee, and the Ethics Committee is meeting now. Not about you, Congressman Shimkus, yeah, yes, and not about me either. But I want you to know that I commend the work of this very fine commission, one of the most important agencies of the federal government. Thank you, Chairman Blackburn.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Welch is not here. So, Mr. Loebsack, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is great to be here today with all these folks. It's good to see you back on the commission. Commissioner Rosenworcel, really appreciate the time when you came into Iowa, to Newton and Baxter, Iowa, to talk about rural broadband. That was really a great opportunity for me to have you there. I am happy to have the opportunity to have all of you here to testify, because I'm always eager to discuss, of course, how we can build out rural broadband in Iowa and across the country, and how we can improve mapping data. That's my big topic today, to ensure we're getting resources to the right places. I'm sure you know my bill that I worked on with Representative Costello over here. The Rural Wireless Act passed into law earlier, Wireless Access Act, I should say, passed into law earlier this year, and it directs you folks to improve and standardize the way the FCC collects wireless coverage data so that maps will accurately reflect wireless coverage. We talked about this before when you were in Northwest Iowa and some of the problems you had when you were losing coverage traveling through Northwest Iowa. I always like to say that better data means better maps and better resources and policies for the areas that are truly in need. And this isn't only about cell phones. Mobile broadband is particularly important in areas that lack fixed broadband services. With the passage of the Rural Wireless Access Act, Congress is speaking, I think, and we're saying that we need to get better maps and better data. So I'm sure you all know that the FCC will have 180 days after the conclusion of the Mobility Fund Phase 2 auction to promulgate regulations in accordance with the Rural Wireless Access Act. But nothing really is stopping you from doing that now, I would argue, or at least sooner. And that's important because the Mobility 2 auction will send more than $4 billion, I think it's about $4.5 billion out the door, and primarily to rural areas. So to me, this seems like a real missed opportunity. We've got to act now, it seems to me. The FCC has heard from industry that we need better maps. It heard from Congress that we need better maps, but the work to create better maps hasn't happened yet, and I think there's some frustration out there about that. I understand that the commission has agreed to, I think this was back a couple months back maybe, to push back the Mobility Fund 2 auction by 90 days to allow the current data challenge process to continue. But I'm concerned that because of the incredible burdens with that process, the FCC's data still may not be fixed. And I can tell you rural America needs this broadband funding as quickly as possible, and I think we can all agree with that. Rather, I think the commission could take this time to make the important fundamental reforms called for by my Rural Wireless Access Act ahead of schedule. And Commissioner Rosenworcel, you say in your testimony that, quote, too often our procedures fall short of what good governance requires. Our mapping practices for broadband do not accurately reflect the state of connectivity on the ground, unquote. And I think that's absolutely right. So my question is to you, really, Commissioner Rosenworcel. When working to advance good governance and best practices, do you think it makes sense for the FCC to move forward with a challenge process that isn't working, or should we be making the real overhaul necessary to fix this problem in a more expedited way?
We have a problem with wireless service in rural America, and you cannot manage problems that you do not measure. Right now, the FCC's mapping process for wireless service is basically asking the largest carriers whether or not they provide service in an area. And then we've invited local officials and small wireless carriers to contest that data. But the process of contesting that data is cumbersome, it's difficult, it's long. It entails setting up an account, downloading 50 pages of information, getting multiple handsets, walking around in cornfields and elsewhere every half a kilometer and taking down information about signal strength and latency, then uploading that with a certification of an engineer and returning it to the FCC for our assessment. I'm going to argue that that process is too burdensome for most wireless communities to undertake. And as a result, I am worried about our mobility fund mapping as it stands today.
Right. And Chairman Pai, I'd like you to respond as well, give you that opportunity if you'd like to respond to that.
Thank you, Congressman. The system we inherited when I came into office in January 2017 was a free-for-all, frankly. Any carrier could use whatever technical standards it wanted to supply whatever information it wanted. That wasn't good enough for me. If we were going to distribute $4.5 billion of funding, I wanted to close the digital divide to serve unserved areas. That is why, under my leadership, we started on a unanimous basis a bespoke, one-time data collection for mobility to see exactly where coverage was and where it wasn't, with a standardized set of rules. And that's why I appreciate the concept behind your legislation. We've extended the deadline, as you pointed out, for the challenge process to give all types of entities the ability to challenge. We've broadened the categories that can challenge. It's not just rural carriers, but state and local governments. We've also extended waivers to everyone from Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia to the Kansas Farm Bureau to be able to participate. Our own staff has done a lot of roadshows, and I believe it is 9 states currently and a number of webinars. We've also created a map with just one unsubsidized competitor to allow companies, anybody, an easier way to pinpoint those areas that are ripe for challenge. All of these steps, I agree, are complex. Nonetheless, something is better than nothing, and nothing is what we started with. We're making progress slowly but surely, and I'm confident when we hold that Mobility Fund auction, folks in Wooten, folks in my home state, everyone will be able to get coverage ultimately because we did the very hard and dirty work collecting this data as best we could.
Well, thanks to all of you, and we'll be staying in touch, I can promise. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And Broadband Loebsack, as we come to know him at this committee, does yield back his time. Mr. Shimkus, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you back. I want to start with Commissioner O'Reilly. I want to just thank you for raising and addressing the 911 fee diversion issue. It's hard to talk about that when my state was good, then it was bad, now I think it's good again. But as Congresswoman Eshoo and I have worked on 911, as many of you know, for a long time, states diverting that money is in essence stealing from the fund in which they were paying into. So I just want to publicly thank you for that. But sticking with you, I've been named to the Farm Bill as a conferee.
Congratulations.
Yeah, get my pitchforks out and get ready. But one of the things that we want to, one of the reasons why we're on there is the broadband deployment and the RUS issues. So how can we get the FCC, the RUS, and NTIA to work together so that we're not duplicating functions or actually working together to address, everyone's talking about, right, rural broadband connectivity, and so every member's mentioned that as part of their discussion. So I'm looking for some advice and some consultation so that when I go in, I can
I'd be more than pleased to provide more technical advice to you. There are extensive provisions in both the House and Senate Farm Bill. There's also the pilot program that was created as part of last year's budget bill. And they all have the potential, as I read them now, to provide duplication with existing programs we have at the FCC. The chairman has done a wonderful job in working with different agencies. But if you look at this, I was looking at language in terms of consultation. It requires consultation. So basically, they will talk to us before they, RUS, for instance, would talk to the FCC before a decision is made. But that doesn't get you a prohibition on duplication. It just requires a consultation. And that has been something.
So we then know about the duplication instead of being surprised.
We know where the limitations are. And if you look at the House bill, for instance, it has different speed. It wants 25.3 compared to where we're trying to fund. And I recognize our speeds and the funding that we do are less than what people would like. But we're trying to stretch our dollars as far as we possibly can. With 14 million people, would say 24 million, depending if you count satellite or not, unfunded households, unserved households today. That's been my primary concern. And so I'd be more than pleased to work with you to try and figure out how to tighten the language to make sure we have duplication, that we have coordination throughout rather than consultation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And let me go to Commissioner Carr, and then if I've got time, I can open it up for other folks. You've done some work already doing what we're trying to do in the SPEED Act, which is address on the deployment, right-sizing historic and environmental rules, not reinventing the wheel if the sighting tower is the same sighting tower, but then you're going to put a 5G system on there. Can you talk about what you've done in the commission so far on that aspect?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman.
I think your mic, that's all.
Thank you, Congressman, for your leadership on these issues. Some of the legislation that you've mentioned contains a lot of really great ideas. There is this global race that's ongoing to 5G. And winning that race isn't just about getting next-gen connectivity in New York or San Francisco. There's thousands of other communities that need their fair shot at 5G. A big portion of 5G is going to be small cells, and one of the challenges there is how do we make the economic case to get small cells everywhere? So by removing regulations that were really designed for 200-foot macro towers, having them continue to apply to those towers, but putting an updated approach for these small cells can make a big difference in extending 5G everywhere.
So then let's just finish with this part of the debate. And in our language, we're directed to federal property and that, parkland and issues because there's a perceived concern by smaller municipalities and stuff that you're going to, could, in the guise of rolling out 5G, that we're going to take away their rights to help in the local decisions. Have you had any of those debates and discussions, and what are your thoughts about that?
We've had a lot of really good, really productive meeting with local elected officials, whether it's county commissioners. As I've been on the road, I was in Boston at the U.S. Conference of Mayors Conference. These local officials deal with issues that we at the FCC will never deal with. If there's an ugly small cell that goes up somewhere, those local officials are the ones that are going to get the call about it, not us. So I think at the end of the day, we can look to try to find some common ground because we share the same goal of getting more broadband deployed.
Again, my time's expired. I wish I would have had more time to talk to everybody, and I yield back. Thanks.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Welch, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. I want to make 3 comments and then discuss 2 topics, rural broadband and the homework gap. The comments are, number 1, thank you for your help on the passage of the Rayburn Act. Number 2, I do commend you for your decision on Sinclair. Number 1, you did it together. It is so important for us to find ways we can do things together. Number 2, if we're going to have strong rural communities, we have to have local institutions, and there's no institution more important locally than local news. And then 3, Commissioner Carr, telehealth, that's a big opportunity for us and really, really essential. The 2 topics I want to speak are about the rural build-out, and I'm going to talk to you, Chairman Pai, a little bit about this. Commissioner Rosenworcel said you can't do something, you can't assess something if you can't measure it. You can't challenge rural broadband or make it universal unless we acknowledge that there's a real problem. And what Congress said in 1996, it required an FCC to report annually on whether advanced telecommunication capability is being deployed to all Americans in a reasonable and timely fashion. In 2016, the Broadband Deployment Report, when you were serving on the commission then, said, you concurred with it, where it was critical of the build-out. You said, I agree, this administration policies have failed to deliver advanced telecommunications capability, broadband, to the American people in a reasonably and timely fashion. And you were explicit. The standards set forth by Congress is not being met. Rural America is being left behind. Fast forward to 2018, in the Broadband Deployment Report, this is under your leadership, there was a determination that broadband services are now being deployed to all Americans on a reasonable and timely basis. And what you said in your statement is the current FCC is now meeting its statutory mandate to encourage the deployment of broadband in a reasonably and timely basis. That's not what Congress is requiring. It's not to encourage, it's to get the job done. I want to spell out some of the facts that I understand to be the case, and you can tell me whether you agree or disagree. 24 million Americans lack access to fixed broadband at speeds of 25.3, the FCC standard. Do you agree with that or not?
I do.
Great. 31% of Americans in rural areas lack access to the broadband service. Do you agree with that?
I do.
All right. 44 million Americans lack access to both fixed broadband at 25.3 speeds and mobile LTE broadband at 10.3 speeds.
I'd have to double check that number, but I don't have any reason to suspect it's incorrect.
Okay, so we're in agreement that there's a problem.
Correct.
And I hope we're in agreement that your job, FCC, all of you, is not to encourage, it's to get it done.
Absolutely.
All right, great. That's good. Now, in listening to you, not just today, but other times, I've heard you talk about what you see as the benefits of deregulation, including the elimination of net neutrality, correct?
Correct.
All right. Let me be explicit. We could give you a pen, and you could write a revocation of every single regulation that exists, will that provide the financial incentive for broadband carriers to build out on dirt roads in Vermont and Iowa, in Kansas, where there is one house every half mile?
Congressman, this is the central problem. In too many parts of this country, there is no private business case for deployment.
That's my point.
And that's why our job—
Deregulation won't get it done where there's no market
That is not correct,
opportunity.
Congressman. Look at the letter from VTEL, which I'd be happy to, which I appended to my testimony.
Well, you know,
VTEL stated specifically that they're spending millions of dollars more because of these regulatory modernizations.
Well, first, thank you. And thank you for bringing up VTEL. And in fact, I happen to be a VTEL customer. And what they said in that letter is they're going to invest $4 million more. We've got 100,000 people underserved in Vermont. What you didn't indicate was that VTEL was the recipient of a $130 million ARA grant. So that's kind of like relevant. There was actual public money that went into helping the broadband build out. So the fundamental question here, okay, because we've got agreement that we've got to get broadband, we've got to get rural America wired. And every single day it's more important that we do that. But it's not going to happen just with deregulation. There's got to be some mapping. There's got to be some bolstered universal fund. There's got to be a promotion of local competition. We had some people in here from rural communities that were having local companies that were doing really hard things and getting it done because their investment was in the community. So I see my time is up, and I didn't even get to the homework gap, Commissioner, which I applaud you for your work on. But this is a real, ongoing problem. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Latta, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for FCC commissioners for being with us today. Chairman Pai, technologies such as the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, blockchain are disrupting the markets and even changing our everyday lives. We need widespread broadband connectivity to drive these technologies to their potential. Is the Commission focusing resources on learning more about these emerging technologies and how critical broadband access is to this discussion?
We are, Congressman, and thank you for that thoughtful question. I've personally spent, both in my because of professional obligations and personal interest, a lot of time thinking about these issues starting in the fall of 2017. And that's part of the reason why recently I announced that the FCC would be hosting a forum later this year on the impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning, in particular on the communications sector, because I think we're simply scratching the surface in terms of the potential of some of these technologies. They've obviously disrupted a number of industries, and I think there's a useful focus for the FCC in thinking about how it could disrupt communications. Similarly, I've been looking at a number of other technologies, virtual reality and augmented reality, blockchain, connected vehicles and the like. I think we need to make sure that we're always keeping track of some of these technologies. It's hard because of both the depth and the breadth of some of these innovations. But nonetheless, I have been talking to a number of experts, including our own chief technology officer, companies in Silicon Valley and the like, about how to make sure that we are aware of some of these changes. And the transformation thus far has been tremendous, but I think over the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be even more mind-blowing.
Well, thank you. Commissioner O'Reilly, the Rayburn Act calls for the FCC and the NTIA to identify 100 megahertz of new unlicensed spectrum under 8 gigahertz by the end of 2022. What steps will the Commission take to free up much-needed unlicensed spectrum to support growing consumer demand for existing technologies and to provide innovation space for the technologies of the future?
Absolutely. Thank you, Congressman. I don't know the answer to your previous question, Chairman Pai. I would say also don't forget about narrowband. Narrowband IoT, very important, but I don't want to get sidetracked. To your point on licensed, the Commission, with the Chairman's great leadership, is going to move forward on a number of things, including in 6 gigahertz, where we're going to hopefully, assuming that an NDY or NPRM is adopted later this fall and move to order sometime next year, provide additional spectrum for unlicensed purposes. We've also been working, Commissioner Rosenworcel and I have been working extensively on 5.9, and I've also raised the question of whether 4.9 may be a place that we can work with to have unlicensed bands and services, because we have reached a maximum capacity. 5 gigahertz is getting rather full in terms of services. 2.4 is already full. So unlicensed is going to have to be a very big portion of our consideration going forward.
Thank you. Commissioner Carr, earlier this week, the House passed the Precision Connectivity Act, and we've all been hearing a lot of questions coming from us, especially when we're talking about rural broadband and getting that access out there. This is a bipartisan bill that I authored with my friend, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Lobzak, which directs the Commission to set up a task force and collaboration with the Secretary of Agriculture, identify and measure gaps in broadband availability and develop policy recommendations to promote rapid broadband expansion on agricultural land. Do you believe the Commission can execute the requirements of the Precision Agriculture Connectivity Act?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I do, and I think it's an important issue, as you point out. The intensive amount of data and broadband that's used in agriculture today is quite mind-blowing. When you get outside of D.C., I was in Moline, Michigan, and you see the high bandwidth uses from connected combines to drones that are taking detailed images down to the tiny dots of a leaf on a crop. We need to find ways to get high-speed broadband for farmers and ranchers. And I think this bill is one way that's going to do it.
Well, let me follow up with that. To what degree will it require a combination of the technologies on the wireline and wireless to meet that broadband challenge for the precision agriculture?
Ultimately, it's going to require a mix of technologies. Fiber is going to work in some places, fixed wireless in other places. We're seeing a new generation of satellite technologies that can also help. So we're going to have a lot of different technologies that are making that last mile work.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Dingle, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, all of you, for being here this afternoon. Chairman Pai, I want to begin with you and ask about your response or lack thereof to a letter that Mr. McNary and myself sent regarding the DDoS attack that crashed the FCC's website during the net neutrality comment period, or what you told us had crashed it. Last year, during a hearing that we were having, you indicated that you'd follow up with the committee to provide information on what had actually happened. Then in another hearing in October, you said, and this is directly from the transcript, you had provided a detailed response to the committee, and I would be happy to provide that to you with some of the particulars in that regard. The committee has never received it. We have not received it. And then you responded to a question for the record by saying you couldn't release the information to the committee. We've learned some information. Now, since then, we've learned some information from the press about this, but we still have a lot more questions than answers and are still waiting for a response. Would you agree, Chairman Pai, that there's something wrong when members of the committee tasked with oversight of the FCC learn about issues from the press when we've been asking about them for more than a year?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. In consultation with the Office of General Counsel, following that particular hearing that you referenced, the General Counsel opined that we require a letter from the committee in order to share certain information because of some of the sensitivity of that information. Should the committee issue such a letter, again, we would be happy to accommodate. Additionally, I want you to know that we have been working with both the General Accountability Office, of course, Congress's investigative arm, as well as the Office of Inspector General at the FCC on these issues. And that has been ongoing for a number of different months. And so the fact that you might not have heard a lot of news from the FCC does not mean we have been working with these independent bodies to investigate these particular issues.
Well, I think this committee would think that we should have some information on this, and so I would. You are saying from the subcommittee chair, the full committee, who do you need to receive that letter from since you haven't been asked enough by enough of us? My
understanding from the General Counsel is that the committee,
Who's your definition of committee? Does that mean Mr. Walden and Mr. Pallone need to send you a letter?
I believe that is correct.
Okay, Madam Chair, can we talk to the full chair about that? Thank you. All right, so then I would like to continue. Since there's already some public information about the attack, will you commit to finally following up with the committee if we get this letter to provide us with reports, requests, memoranda, service logs related to the DDoS attack, the FCC's protocol for documenting it, and what steps you're taking to mitigate events like this going forward.
Congressman, what I can tell you is that, again, we have been working cooperatively with the Office of Inspector General. The Inspector General has done a fantastic job investigating this issue, and I don't want to speak for him, but what I can say is that I would expect him to issue more information on this in the very near future.
Hopefully to the committee that has jurisdiction. Chairman Pai, let me also ask you about a letter that you were sent asking for an investigation into whether companies improperly sold TV viewer data to Cambridge Analytica. You punted this matter to the FTC, which I disagree with, but we did a follow-up letter asking further questions about this decision. It's critical that the FCC enforce privacy protections of the Communications Act to the fullest extent. When can we expect a response to this letter, and why did the FCC decline to conduct an investigation into this?
Appreciate the question, Congresswoman. The agency is a creature of Congress. We can only exercise authority that Congress has delegated to the agency. In this particular case, there are two specific authorities, Section 338 and Section 631. Those authorities extend to cable operators and satellite systems. Neither TiVo nor ComScore is a satellite operator or a cable system, so we cannot exercise jurisdiction under them in the manner in which you requested. Additionally, to the extent that you were asking about the company Dish and its provision of aggregate data, that is a specific exception from the statutory authority that does not allow us to exercise jurisdiction. And so it wasn't simply a punt, but a recognition of reality under the current law that the Federal Trade Commission can be and is expressly authorized under Section 5 of the FTC Act and other authorities to investigate this particular matter. And that's why we referred it to them. They are the primary privacy cop on the beat, and we want them to be able to look at this issue consistent with your request.
I'm out of time, so I can't keep asking. I had more. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Guthrie, you're recognized.
Thank you. Commissioner Carr, first I want to talk to you. This isn't necessarily directly FCC, but it's something you've been working on. I'm very interested in here, and it's the skills gap and apprenticeships. I worked with Susan Davis from California on another committee, and I had the Wireless Infrastructure Association came to see me, and I don't know if you were with them or somebody else, but you actually climbed a tower recently, and they were trying to figure out how 5G deployment could be held up just by not having the skills of people the men and women to be able to go out and deploy 5G, and so and I know I have like 6,500 open jobs in my community. If you show up with some skill, it's easy to do a living wage. If you show up with skills, I mean, you have a career. And so I know that's an interest of you in terms of this area. Could you talk about things that you've worked in this area, what the skills gap is, and some things you think we should be able to do to help close that?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. You mentioned I climbed a cell tower in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I demonstrated my own skills gap, attempting to keep up with the people doing that. But to your point, the skills gap, in my view, comes in two places. One, when you look at the deployment of next generation network, 5G, these thousands of small cells, right now we potentially don't have the workforce in place that can do that work, the deployment of it, the consideration of the RF implication in terms of where you set an antenna up to get coverage. And then we also see it in communities being able to have the skills to take advantage once those connections are in place. I was in Detroit at a school that's trying to give either low-income people recently released from prison, the training and the job skills they need to take advantage of the digital economy. To your point, I think there's more we can do on the apprenticeship side with streamlining those efforts to make it easier for people to move into this space. I've done some events with the Department of Labor geared towards that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And as I said, that moves towards careers instead of just jobs, and that's what we really want to reach out to help people with. Also, so Chairman Pai, in the Ray Bombs Act, Doris Matsui, or Congresswoman Matsui and myself had the auction deposits bill that was included into that area. My question is for you and Commissioner Riley. I think, Commissioner Riley, you both brought that to our attention. Are you seeing any other barriers in the auction mechanics that may need statutory fix to streamline to make the auctions go smoother or better? Both of you
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Before I do that, I want to assure the subcommittee that we consulted with the general counsel, and had something happen to Commissioner Carr on that tower climb, the FCC still would have had a quorum sufficient to discharge as prescribed by Congress. But more seriously, we are so grateful to you, to Congresswoman Matsui, and to the entire subcommittee for your leadership in fixing that problem. As I look at the lay of the land in terms of our legal authority, we have sufficient authority at this point, with the exception of the budgeting issues that I talked about earlier, to make sure that we can conduct auctions in an expeditious and productive way.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner O'Reilly, I have another question for you if you want to answer that.
I was going to answer to the point. I don't think it's a question of authority. I think it's a question of what this committee does very well, which is oversight and following up to make sure that the auction software is advanced to meet the goals for the future.
Okay, thank you. And also for you, Commissioner O'Reilly, thank you for your support on the 6 gigahertz proceeding in your testimony. As you know, this is an important issue for the Spectrum Caucus. Would you like to elaborate on the need for this spectrum and what time frame you expect to see, what time frame you expect to see for the expected NPRM? If you could be more specific than maybe the fall or something like that.
No, absolutely. So the predominant bands that I mentioned before, 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, are congested. And so we need to add more unlicensed spectrum to the portfolio for all the benefits that they bring that I've talked about in the past. Commissioner Rosenworcel and I have worked together on this issue. 6 gigahertz is what I consider the second best option for additional unlicensed spectrum next to 5.9. We've been working hard on that. It has been a very difficult slog to try to come to resolution, but 6 gigahertz may be something we can move forward quicker. It is the uplink to C-band. C-band has the other component that this committee has talked about earlier, or the subcommittee has talked about a little bit earlier. In terms of the point on the timing, that is something that the chairman, I don't want to get ahead of him, but I think that the goal is to have NPRM this fall time frame.
Commissioner Rosenworcel, do you have any comments on that?
No, I agree with much of what my colleague, Commissioner O'Reilly, said. Unlicensed spectrum has historically been scraps in our airwaves. We have got to be intentional about it. We need more Wi-Fi in our skies, and we've got opportunities in the 5.9 gigahertz band and 6 gigahertz band, and it's time to pursue them.
Well, thank you very much. And my time is almost expired, so I'll stop there. I yield back 15 seconds.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. McNerney, you're recognized.
I thank the chair, and I thank the commissioners for your work. It can't be that easy, but hopefully rewarding. Chairman Pai, it's been 2 months since we learned about the VPN filter, the Russian-linked malware that can be used to steal users' information, exploit devices, and block network traffic. Hundreds of thousands or more routers have been compromised, yet consumers either know nothing about it or if they've been left wondering if their router is affected and how to take action. And these are routers that are being rented from their ISPs. Do you agree that the ISPs have a responsibility to inform consumers they lease routers to about known vulnerabilities? Can you answer yes or no?
Congressman, we do want to ensure that consumers get the information they need about the security of their equipment.
Do the ISPs have a responsibility here?
Legally, I would have to look into it, but certainly as a general business matter, I would hope that they would inform consumers about any risks to that equipment.
Is the FCC doing anything to encourage ISPs to inform customers about this malware and how to update their routers, or if their routers have been compromised?
Congressman, I have to be a little bit circumspect on this issue. I can't comment on things that might have some classification to them, but we'd be happy to work with you to provide what information we can on the subject.
Well, is the FCC doing anything at all to help protect customers against malware from their routers?
Again, there are certain issues I can't discuss, but generally speaking, yes, we do monitor any potential threats to equipment, and we work with the industry to make sure that they apprise customers about it.
Commissioner Rosenworcel, do you think the FCC has a role in protecting consumers from cybersecurity threats?
Yes, I think the FCC has a role in protecting consumers from cybersecurity threats. I also think our equipment authorization process is of note here. Those routers have to be authorized by the agency because they use radio frequency. We could certainly look into using our Part 15 process to certify that they'll notify consumers of any malware or cyber risks associated with their use.
Well, thank you for that answer. The GAO has committed to investigating fake comments submitted to the FCC in the net neutrality repeal proceeding, and I understand that the New York Attorney General is investigating as well. As it stands, we know that at least 2 million of these comments are fake, some even coming from Russian email addresses. Commissioner Rosenworcel, Is it your view that the FCC has been cooperating with law enforcement agencies?
I do not believe we've been cooperating with law enforcement agencies. I think that's a problem. 2 million people's identities were stolen in our record. That is a federal crime under Title 18. It's also a crime in many states. We should be referring these matters to state attorneys general and the Department of Justice.
Thank you. Chairman Pai, can you commit to ensuring that your office and the FCC as a whole will cooperate with these investigations?
Congressman, we have been cooperating with the General Accountability Office. As I said, the Office of Inspector General is looking into this issue. In addition, I proactively have announced recently in a letter in response to Senators Merkley and Toomey that we would be changing our process to ensure that some of the issues that arose last time, for example, 7.5 million comments in support of Title II using fakemailgenerator.com, 400,000 pro-Title II comments from a single address in Chelyabinsk, Russia, that those things don't happen. And so we're exploring the use of CAPTCHA and other potential solutions, assuming we get authorization from our appropriations committees for reprogramming of certain funds.
Well, I'm still waiting for a response for the reports, and this is following up on Mrs. Dingell's comments. Reports, request memoranda related to the alleged DDoS attack on the comment system, requesting that these documents multiple times now, and hope that you'll provide them sometime soon.
Congressman, again, to follow up on my response to Congresswoman Dingell, we've been working with the Inspector General. He's done a fantastic job on this, and stay tuned. They will be issuing information. In the meantime, additionally, as I said, in consultation with the General Counsel, we require a letter from the committee in order to supply certain types of information that you are seeking.
Are there any steps you're taking now to prevent comments from being filed in a manner that would impact your proceedings?
Yes, sir. So we are, as I said, exploring in consultation with our career staff and the Office of Managing Director and others, solutions like CAPTCHA or other similar mechanisms to ensure the integrity of our proceedings. The system we inherited in January 2017 was designed to have it be a fully open process that anyone can participate in, but we want to make sure that it is one that, again, respects the integrity of the FCC's processes and confirms the seriousness of our work.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenworcel, last question. I'm concerned about the proposed change to the Lifeline program. I'm worried that if adopted, it will only further widen the digital divide and be a major setback for vulnerable populations like veterans. The proposed changes, could you give me an idea how that might affect veterans?
I appreciate the question. I am, in fact, the daughter of an Air Force veteran. There are 1.3 million veterans in this country that rely on the Lifeline program today. And in fact, at the behest of Senator McCain and Senator Blumenthal, we expanded the program to include the Veterans Pension Program so that more veterans could apply and participate so that when they finish their service, they can reacclimate to civilian life and have communications necessary to do so. I think it would be offensive if this agency decided to cut them off from communication service.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Olson, you're recognized.
I thank the chair and welcome to our four leaders of the FCC. Chairman Pai, Texans back home in Texas 22 want me to thank you for standing up for a thriving internet. They're grateful for your actions to stop the false net neutrality rules of the previous administration. You found out firsthand what my former boss, Texas Senator Phil Gramm, found out about killing a bad government program or a rule. It's easier to kill a vampire than a bad government program. Yet you persevered, and now again, to channel Phil Gramm, the previous rule is deader than Elvis. It's again hurricane season. I'd like to also thank you for coming down within days after Harvey hit Houston to help us on the ground recover with our telecommunication systems. I'm hopeful this year is not like that last year. Harvey, Irma, Marie, fires. We have to make sure we're prepared. Can you update us on what the FCC has done to prepare for hurricanes and other disasters this year?
Thanks so much for the question, Congressman, and thank you and the folks in your district for hosting me when I was in Houston after Hurricane Harvey. We're doing a number of things to make sure that our networks are as resilient as possible and that restoration is as quick as possible. In terms of funding, we have extended funding to make sure in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, for instance, that we can restore those networks as quickly as possible. And we've also extended a number of different waivers and streamlining orders to make sure that carriers can focus on rebuilding networks instead of paperwork to the FCC. Additionally, we've engaged in a number of different experiments, for example, granting an experimental license to Google to use Project Loon to beam internet access from balloons. In a situation like that, we don't care what technology is used to get people back on the grid. We want them to get back on. Additionally, we've been working to make sure that our wireless emergency system is much more resilient. I'm happy talking about some of the different steps there, but the bottom line is we are making sure that these alerts are more targeted, are more informational, and the consumers don't tune them out. An additional one that is specific to you that I thought I would mention, because a lot of people don't think about this, some 33 trillion gallons of water were dumped in your part of Texas in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. That had a huge impact on those parts of the area that only had copper lines in the ground. Copper it degrades when it is under severe water pressure, and if it's exposed to water, it is utterly useless. And those areas of Houston that had fiber were much more resilient. Either the cell towers didn't go down or the networks stayed up altogether. And so I think that's important when we talk about some of our copper retirement rules and other nitty-gritty wireline reforms that we've got, is that there's a huge public safety benefit to doing this. NG 911 and the rest. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. All of these issues that we've been talking about previously have a public safety dimension that I think we should all recognize.
Yeah, remind me to thank you for all those emergency messages came over, warning tornado, warning floods, warning, swamped the whole system. With your work, it's targeted now to where it actually is, as opposed to hitting a whole county, it's hitting a city. And that's a big deal because we were bombed. We got spammed by all these, it just became nothing after days of these budgets going off. So thank you for acting quickly to make that happen. Commissioner Carr, you've been leading the FCC in finding new ways to reduce government red tape. And you know that slows 5G deployment. Verizon has just announced it plans to launch 5G in Houston, Texas later this year. Can you tell me how your work will help expedite this rollout quickly in Houston?
Thanks very much, Congressman, for the question. I'm glad to see that Houston is going to be on the leading edge of getting 5G. That's something that we want to replicate across the country. So we have a number of reforms that we've already taken that's going to reduce the cost of deployment. That's going to make a big difference, particularly in costly, difficult to serve areas. We have a number of ideas that we're continuing to look at the Commission. I also wanted to follow up on your earlier question. I was also in Houston at the Harris County 911 Center and saw the great work that they were able to do there in response to Hurricane Harvey.
And one last question, run out of time here, but this is for you, Commissioner Pai. As you probably know from my biography, I spent 9 years in the Navy, a lieutenant commander, a leader in the Navy. You're the leader of this FCC, this commission. You have a member who's climbed up a cell tower. As leader, don't you think you should follow his lead and climb up a cell tower as well? Somewhere in South Dakota, maybe?
That was a curveball I had not prepared for, Congressman. Although Commissioner Carr is far younger and more nimble than I am, nonetheless, I will put my own life at risk to ascend perhaps a 10-foot tower to inspect a small cell somewhere in Houston once the deployment is ready.
I'll go with you. I yield back.
And the gentleman will not only go with you, he will climb the tower. Ms. Matsui, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome to all the panelists. I don't have a climb the tower question here. But anyway, I want to follow up on my Spectrum Caucus co-chair, who's Brett Guthrie, talking about 6 gigahertz. I understand the Commission is planning to move forward with NPRM to explore the possibility of opening the bands known as collectively 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed use in the fall. Commissioner O'Reilly and Commissioner Rosenworcel, what interference protection to mitigation techniques such as frequency coordination could protect incumbents and allow unlicensed operations in this band?
Well, thank you. Those that have been interested in making 6 gigahertz available for unlicensed use have put forward engineering studies to show that the harmful interference would be minimal, and they have recommended a number of mitigation efforts that will all have to be explored as part of the NPRM this fall.
Okay.
We do have before us some engineering studies, like my colleague referenced. The most important thing we can do is put this out for a rulemaking so that we make it possible for the 6 gigahertz band to be used for unlicensed service in the near future.
Right, great, thank you. Last week, I announced that I'm working on legislation to direct the Department of Commerce to convene a working group of federal and industry stakeholders to develop a consensus-based definition of blockchain. Distributed ledger systems such as blockchain have particularly interesting potential applications in communication networks, including in IoT deployments and spectrum sharing. Next-generation networks, including 5G-capable radios, have the opportunity to ensure spectrum is being used as efficiently as possible. But there currently is no common definition of blockchain, which could potentially hinder in its deployment in spectrum use cases where sharing may be the only viable option. Commissioner Rosenwart, so what potential could blockchain have in increasing spectrum efficiency?
Thank you for the question and being so forward-thinking about this. I've written some piece for Wired and elsewhere where I've pointed out that spectrum is a scarce resource. We need to come up with more efficient ways to distribute it, other than just traditional licensed and unlicensed regimes. And using distributed ledger technology like blockchain could make that possible. We could see dynamic leasing, we could see lightweight leasing, we could see a lot more innovative uses of this scarce resource. So I think what you're describing is the right way to go.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on to the C-band. I commend the FCC's work to identify the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band as a potential core mid-range band for next-generation networks. This band has propagation characteristics that make it ideal for reliable satellite distribution and particularly valuable 5G mobile networks. The NPRM that you unanimously approved earlier this month appropriately recognized that the Commission had insufficient information on incumbent operations that may need to be protected in the band. I appreciate the NPRM sought additional information on existing Earth station uses of C-band satellites as well as a previous application filing freeze. Chairman Pai, how is the work to gather additional information on incumbent users going?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. It's going well, in part because we have extended the time and the latitude that some of these folks have to register with us. We've extended the time frame by 90 days until October 17th. We've streamlined the fees and the reports that are required for them to be able to report. And so at the end of the day, this fall, we hope to be able to come to you to let you know that we have a much more robust picture of where these stations are in order to allow us to proceed to a fully informed decision about the fate of the C-band.
Okay, fine, thank you. Mindful that clearing federally held spectrum is both critical in our effort to facilitate deployment of next-generation networks and a congressionally mandated preference, I'm interested in new ways to ensure we're using spectrum more efficiently and innovatively. Back in 2004, for instance, the FCC considered the role that opportunistic technologies and access systems could play in promoting leasing arrangements between commercial users and license holders. Specifically, I'm interested in a legislative framework that would further facilitate the opportunity for NTIA to coordinate with the FCC and allow federal agencies to lease spectrum to commercial users. Commissioner Carr, I know there's not much time, but how do you believe additional spectrum sharing arrangements could balance the certainty and deployment needs of both commercial providers and government users?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question and thank you for your longstanding leadership on spectrum issues. I think you're right. I think we need to put even more tools on the table, even more options on the table, and we should be exploring all ways to get more spectrum out there for consumer use.
Oh, thank you. And I just want to make a comment. In my work on this committee, I've been focused on expanding access to telehealth services, so I thank you, Commissioner Carr, for your focus on them. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and to our commissioners, thank you all very much for being here. Chairman Pai, earlier this year, Congress provided funding to NTIA. We talked a little bit about the mapping issue. We provided that funding to NTIA to update the National Broadband Mapping coordination with the FCC. How's that coordination effort going, and do you believe that a process that uses state and commercial data in addition to the material the Commission collects from the Form 477 process will render a more accurate and useful map?
I appreciate the question, Congressman, and your leadership on this issue. I have personally spoken to the administrator of NTIA about this issue. In addition to that, our staffs have been in touch to share expertise to make sure that they aren't reinventing any wheels and that we're all on the same page in terms of the need for mapping. In terms of the second part of your question, which of course now I've forgotten, sorry.
It was, do you believe the process that uses state and commercial data in addition to the material from the 477 process will render a more accurate and useful map?
Our hope is that it will, and in the meantime, what we have done under my leadership over the last year and a half is to start a comprehensive review of the Form 477 process to make sure that the information that we get is as granular as is feasible and is as usable as possible for all of the folks who need it, including NTIA, Congress, the FCC, and others.
Yeah, I know you know, and I think the other commissioners agree too that an accurate map is important, and I appreciate what you said about not reinventing the wheel. You know, this is not rocket science. I mean, we ought to be able to produce a map, and we ought to be able to produce a map very, very quickly. An accurate map is the starting point for solving this problem, and it's just been it's been an issue that has just been dragging and dragging and dragging. So, whatever you folks can do to encourage and push that along, it really is important to rural areas where we're suffering with intellectual capital loss, the rural-urban divide being very real. You guys know that.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. Chairman Pai, cybersecurity is obviously a very important issue as well for our country, and there continues to be debate over which agency or which commission should take the lead on cybersecurity. I know that the telecommunications industry works routinely with the Department of Homeland Security, and conversations that occur with DHS are held in confidence, and that's required by statute. Obviously, that kind of protection of information encourages sharing of critical and confidential information, which we all agree is the best way to safeguard our communication systems. I understand, however, that same statutory protections do not exist at the FCC. So are you concerned that the FCC and DHS could work at cross purposes, which may undermine cybersecurity?
Great question, Congressman. Cybersecurity is a critical issue, and it seems like every week there's a new story that draws our attention to that fact. I'm happy to report that over the last year and a half, we've had a very close and productive working relationship with the Department of Homeland Security. In fact, this very morning, I spoke with DHS about some cybersecurity issues that have popped up. And so we certainly want to make sure we're on the same page there. Our role under current law is to act in more of a consultative fashion with DHS, which has the lead in terms of cybersecurity. Should Congress see fit to change the law, currently the only arguable source of authority would be Section 1 of the Communications Act, which is a very high-level, broad statement, which doesn't give us operative authority there, as well as arguably Section 222, which is more consumer proprietary network information. But should Congress change the law, we would dutifully administer it to make sure that our networks are secure. And in the meantime, I'll continue to work collaboratively with DHS and other federal partners, including the intelligence community, to make sure that cybersecurity is reinforced as an important issue.
Okay, and I can't get two questions in here, but I'm going to try. 5G, you know, the United States won the race to 4G, increased our economy, according to some reports, by nearly $100 billion and drove an 84% increase in wireless-related jobs. Because of that leadership, the wireless industry now supports over 4.7 million jobs and contributes $475 billion annually to the U.S. economy, according to that Accenture report. What should the FCC do to ensure that we maintain our global lead in 5G so that all of those economic and job benefits continue to occur here in the U.S.?
Congressman, exactly what we are doing, being very aggressive on spectrum, holding the 28 and 24 gigahertz auctions this fall, 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz next year. In addition, looking at other bands, 3.7, 6 gigahertz, and others. In terms of infrastructure, we need to make sure that we continue to modernize our regulations to incentivize the construction and use of the small cells and distributed antenna systems and other guts of the future 5G networks. And I can tell you our work is having an impact, not just on my own word, but I recently came from two conferences, one in Switzerland, one in Panama, and to hear from regulators everywhere around the world, from Algeria to Guyana to even Trinidad and Tobago to Fiji, tell us they are looking to the United States for leadership because, as one regulator put it to me, you guys are doing it right and we follow your lead on this 5G issue. That is something that I think reinforces the fact that we are doing the right thing.
Let us know how we can help. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Eshoo, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and welcome to the entire commission. Commissioner Rosenworcel said 9 months is a school year. It's also the length of time that it takes for a child to come into this world. So it's been a while. It's been a while. Welcome back. I want to set the record straight on a couple of things first. People, I mean, it's been said that people are entitled to their opinions, but not their own facts. It's been cast about here today that it is somehow a fiction that my Republican friends destroyed net neutrality and wiped out privacy on the internet. That's not fiction, that's a fact. On December 14th, 2017, the commission voted to upend the net neutrality rules that were in place and that had been tested in court. Nonetheless, that was rescinded. On March 28th, 2017, a CRA went sweeping through this committee. It was authored by our chairwoman, went through the full committee, went like a prairie fire through the House of Representatives, and removed all privacy protections from the internet. I know what I voted on. Obviously, I voted no. Others voted yes. But to say that that these things somehow are a rumor or people are referring to them and they're not so is simply not the fact. So I want to really set that down because I think it's important too. Mr. Chairman, I want to quickly follow up on Congressman McNerney's question, where he specifically asked whether the FCC is cooperating with law enforcement agencies, et cetera, et cetera. Is that referred to the Bureau or to the Commission?
Sorry, Congresswoman, is what referred
The investigations, you know, referring the, the violations. Is that a referral to does the Bureau act on that, or does the full commission act on that?
If we're talking about the same thing, the letter was referred to our Office of General Counsel.
So what does that mean? What I want to know is, has there been a referral to a law enforcement agency? That's what I think Congressman McNerney was asking you. But you talked about the GAO, I think the FTC, the I don't know what not, the IG, the FC. So have you referred these violations to a law enforcement agency? That's what I'd like to know, yes or no?
Congresswoman, we have consulted with the Department of Justice.
No.
We don't have jurisdiction to.
Has it been referred to for examination? Have you asked for an investigation of it?
Congresswoman, it's not our role to administer Title 18. That's a Department of Justice issue.
Well, I think you don't want to answer the question. I mean, I don't want to litigate it with you. I just want a yes or no.
Congressman, it's very simple. To the extent that we have jurisdiction here, we've worked with the Office of Inspector General. We've worked with the General Accountability Office.
I think I know what your quote answer is. I want to get to something, and I don't have much time, and it probably is going to be more of a statement than anything else. It's been said that we have 24 million Americans that either have no broadband service or very slow broadband service in the country. Shame on all of us. Is there a 5-year plan at the FCC on this? Some of it may belong in the private sector. Some of it, you need authority from the Congress and our subcommittee. Other actions the commission can take. But when that's stitched together, we have solved this issue. Every time the commission comes here, all of our subcommittee hearings, we go over and over and over and over this issue, and it's not getting any better. So can someone enlighten me on this? Yes, Commissioner.
So, in fairness, the commission has spent an incredible amount of work on this.
I think
We've done
we
the
all
easy
have,
stuff.
but
We've done the
I don't
easy
sense
stuff.
we're making progress.
We've done the easy stuff, the easy locations. We're working on what I would consider the medium locations. We have an ongoing auction right now for the CAF Phase 2 auction. What's left over from that and what's left over from our remote area, or from our rate of return areas that don't get served under our program there, is what are going to be the hardest
So
to
what
serve.
will that knock out of the park, what you just described, of the 24 million?
Yeah, that's what's, it depends on I don't use your time, but it's 14 million if you don't, it's 24 million only if you don't count satellite that's serving 10 million people today with 25.3. So, but it is important. I don't mean to say that 14 million should be ignored, but we are working on the really hard area. Remote areas fund needs to be set up, and we're going to need additional funding that we don't have today, and we require contributions from Congress and federal dollars, which I've testified in favor of, and the dollars went to other federal agencies.
I backed you up on it.
Or it's going to require additional contributions from ratepayers to the likes we haven't seen before.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Bilirakis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it so very much, and I welcome the commission and the chairman. And Chairman, thank you very much for coming to my area and speaking to my constituents. I really appreciate it very much. Chairman Pai, again, while you were in Tampa, the Tampa Bay area, you were able to review the testing that Charter was doing, Charter Communications was doing in and around the district. In particular, they're conducting trials in the 3.5 band, which is showing promise for better and faster rural coverage. At the same time, the 3.5 band is utilized by federal radar systems, which is used by the Navy and Coast Guard on the Gulf Coast of Florida, as well as other areas. The environmental sensing capability, ESC, has been created to ensure these federal uses are not interfered with, while also allowing shared spectrum with industry and preparing the 5G enabled technology. This band provides a great opportunity for industry and competition as long as we ensure federal systems remain secure. What is the status of ESC implementation and interference sensitivity standards, please?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And first and foremost, though, thank you for the hospitality you showed me both in Tampa and in Oldsmar. It was a terrific visit to the district. I'm very excited about the possibilities of 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, in part because of that trial you showed. I mean, to be able to see how Charter is using and how others potentially could use the spectrum to provide a seamless high-definition video experience as you're driving down the road. I mean, very simple application, but very powerful one nonetheless for consumers. The ESC is a critical part of that, and so I'm happy to report that we are actively working with both NTIA and the Department of Defense on the testing. The testing is very complex, and so I can't give you a definitive time frame on when it is going to be completed or what the results might show, but do know that we are working as quickly as possible to wrap that testing up to enable ESC to allow shared use of this valuable resource.
Very good. Commissioner O'Reilly, I know you're leading the charge on the 3.5. Do you have anything to add to that?
So I would agree with the chairman on this, but I would say there's two parts. There's the SAS, which deals with the commercial users, and the ESC, which deals with the federal users and how we make sure we don't cause interference. Those things, a couple months ago, we thought might separate in time-wise. I was briefed yesterday that it looks like things are lining up nicely, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think Q1 of next year is not irrational, if not earlier. We're hoping to do some things that I can't speak of, but hopefully be able to announce some things regarding the SAS later this year, and then be able to ESCs and really soon after. So I think things are lining up pretty nicely along those decisions. But can I go back to your earlier, and I want to use your time, but
please.
You mentioned the point regarding Charter, and I get back to Congressman Doyle's point regarding census tracts. Charter has advocated a different position in terms of they haven't favored census tracts, they've favored counties. And so there are different positions in just census tracts, and I'm trying to work out and try and find a commonality of the different entities that are seeking this. I will tell you, those that have favored census tracts have not moved or advocated 1 inch from where they have been for the last number of years. They will not yield anything to where they've been. So it's been hard to try and find commonality amongst all these different positions, and you mentioned Charter, so I thought I'd bring that up.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the update. Back in March, after a very long wait, the D.C. Circuit Court issued its opinion on the telephone Consumer Protection Act. In particular, this ruling invalidated the definition of an auto dialer and also did away with the Commission's reassigned number and safe harbor rules. In light of this opinion, what action is the FCC taking to establish valid TCPA definitions and rules that target bad actors but do not put everyday Americans at risk to lawsuits? Commissioner, maybe, Mr. Chairman, can you address that?
I'd be happy to, Congressman. We are still actively studying the results of the opinion in ACA International, and we were working with our staff on the way forward on some of the key issues they identified: the definition of auto dialer, the reassigned number database, revocation of consent, and the like. And so, again, I can't give you a specific time frame, but we are actively looking at a variety of TCPA issues as a result of the D.C. Circuit's opinion.
Well, Madam Chair, I've got one more question, but I'll go ahead and yield back my time, and I'll submit it for the record. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back, and Mr. Flores, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Also, I want to thank all the members of the Commission for being with us today. Let me compliment you on something. I think that the Commission has done an excellent job of taking the statutory authorities that you've gotten from Congress and to effectuate the rollout of 5G. Based on what I've seen from the stakeholders in this space, we're moving much more quickly than I ever would have envisioned. We're going to have fixed wireless 5G in Houston as a test case at the end of this year. That's amazing when you can talk about speeds up to 3 to 10 gigabits. That's amazing. So good work on getting that done. Want to talk to you about, and that's also, I think, sets the stage for a cost-effective way to roll out rural broadband eventually. And so I appreciate the work on that to take care of the 24 million people that have been widely talked about during this this hearing. Commissioners Pye and O'Reilly, you both touched in your testimony about what you're doing in terms of the making spectrum available for 5G, and part of that entails dealing with the FM radio stations that were left out during the original legislation. My bill that deals with that was addressed in the Rayburn Act, and also we've set aside the appropriations for you to do that. You have moved quickly to have an NPRM at your next hearing on August the 2nd. Can you give us a preview of what we can expect in that regard, just in a few seconds?
Congressman, I certainly hope we'll see a unanimous vote next week on my proposal, but I don't want to speak for my colleagues. But it's important for us to take that authority you gave us and run with it as quickly as possible, get public input on what the right procedures should be to protect full power Class A TV stations, FM radio stations, and others as a result of the incentive auction.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to another subject, believe it or not, one of the biggest complaints that I'm receiving from my constituency, which is generally happy, is that they are upset about robocalls. And I don't think that's come up today. And I know you all are taking steps in terms of stopping the spoofing of phone numbers and so forth. Can you give us an update on where we stand in that regard? I guess who owns that among this group? Oh, Chairman Pye.
I drew the short
You get all the big ones, don't you? So.
Yeah, we're doing a lot, Congressman. Thanks for the question. And this is an issue that frustrates me. Even last week when I was on vacation, I spent several minutes on a phone with several robocallers trying to figure out who they were, how they got my information, and the like. We're doing a lot. So over the last year and a half since I've been in office, we've adopted a notice of inquiry on call authentication, essentially a digital fingerprint for every single phone call. We've also, in that regard, blessed the private sector group called the Nancy, which is looking at call authentication.
Good.
Secondly, we're taking steps to allow carriers to block spoofed calls, that is calls that obviously aren't from your area code, but nonetheless appear to be. Additionally, we're taking very aggressive action in terms of enforcement. Oh, sorry, I should mention also the reassigned number database to allow those legitimate callers to know whether or not a number has been reassigned to somebody who doesn't want to be called. Additionally, on the back end, so to speak, taking very aggressive enforcement action. The largest fine ever imposed in the FCC's entire history was against a robocaller in Florida, about $120 million. Good. Additional multi-million-dollar fines there, too. I personally have spoken with some of my counterparts abroad because a lot of these robocaller operations come from other countries, and our jurisdiction only stops at the water's edge. And largely, they've been very willing to cooperate with us on that.
Good. What do you need additional statutory authority at this stage of the game to be able to fight this epidemic?
I think we have a fairly broad authority, but to the
do,
extent that Congress is willing to give us more tools in terms of statutes of limitations or the like, we would love to work with you on that.
Let us know what you think you need. I want to move to the mid-band spectrum and just the remaining minute that I have. Part of the mid-band spectrum at 5.9 gigahertz was set aside for what was called dedicated short-range communications, or DRSC. That is a part of the spectrum that could be used for autonomous trucking, autonomous vehicles. You can have vehicle-to-vehicle communications, vehicle-to-infrastructure communications. There seems to be, well, let me say this. Other people want to use that for unlicensed Wi-Fi and things like that to try to offload some data transmission from the cellular bands. This section seems to be congested or subject to future congestion. What do you see for the future of the 5.9 gigahertz part of the spectrum?
It's a good question, Congressman, and Commissioners O'Reilly and Rosenworcel have long been advocating for this, as have Congresswoman Eshoo and I in an op-ed we did a few years ago. We are working actively with our Office of Engineering Technology at the FCC, along with the NTIA and NHTSA, the Department of Transportation, and others, to figure out the way forward. So right now we're in phase 1 of testing. There's been a report that is in draft mode that we have shared with our federal partners. We hope to be able to move forward on that soon. Ultimately, this has to be a collaborative effort. There are a lot of different agencies with different equities here. But ultimately, we want to make the highest valued use of this spectrum.
Okay.
And,
I have some more stakeholders at home that are working on this. The Texas Transportation Institute is trying to design the trucking system of the future, and so they're pretty worried about what happens to this band. So we'll send some supplemental questions for you.
Okay,
thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Collins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner O'Reilly, I was maybe spend my time talking about the, what are we going to call it, the 911 diversion, the Fee Integrity Act that we're putting forward. You were kind enough to come visit in my area. We went to a PSAP in Niagara County, which does not have the latest technology. They're quite frustrated. They don't have the monies to get there. And because of your visit, we got a lot of press on this, we shined a light on New York State's diversion. So maybe just for the record to get this out there, New York has about 13 million cell phones. We're 20 million people. That kind of makes sense. Little kids may not have them. The states set their own fee, which in this case, New York set the highest fee in the nation at $1.20 per month for the cell phones, raising $185 million for the 911, what's supposed to be for the 911 service. But as in what our bill would forbid, New York State's diverting about 40% of that money to the general fund to be wasted in Albany. And that's about $75 million a year that should be going to upgrade PSAPs like we have in Niagara County that are in woeful need of it. Instead, the money's just being frittered away in Albany. So our bill would put that $75 million back on the table, not only for New York, New Jersey, Guam, and a few others that seem to have no interest short of some laws that would forbid this. And I will tell you, most of the folks in our district were, astounded to know that the 911 service charge that's on their cell phone bill every day was not all going for 911 service. They did not have a subtraction for New York State diversion. It's a 911 fee and then New York State diversion. So your visit was well received in a bipartisan way. Certainly all of the counties which are struggling for funds and want to update, they want to know when a call comes in, who's calling, where they are instantly so they can dispatch the people, that everything is moving together. And some of these PSAPs are, decades old. And in some cases, Erie County where I live, there's literally a dozen or more PSAPs. They aren't even consolidated within a county because this sheriff department wants theirs, this city police wants theirs, some fire issues. Even though all the cell phone calls go to one place and there's not too many landlines, people are somewhat protective of it. Again, I want to thank you for helping us shine a light on this, and to further put this forward, Niagara County, where we were, we've done some research since then. Over the last 5 years, they've paid $10 million. This is not a large county. $10 million have gone into Albany as part of the $1.20 per phone. And while New York State diverted 40%, that still should have left $6 million to come back to Niagara County, but since each state makes its own rules, New York State, I think, tends to favor the downstate areas. Only $2 million came back to Niagara County. So they paid in $10 million with their residents thinking this $10 million is supposed to help our PSAP in Niagara County. Lo and behold, only $2 million came in. I can assure you, if that other $8 million, or even if the state diverted, if the remaining $4 million had come in, they would have upgraded that PSAP. The residents would be safer. Those working in those PSAPs, which is a very hard, frustrating job, would feel better when they go home at night. With your input, I just want to point out again, one of the things that this bill would do is to have the states not only stop diverting, but we would have the FCC better define what would be a use. Because, the minute they stop diverting, they may say, well, for public safety, we're going to fix that pothole over here. Well, no, this is in need of some federal oversight. And again, if you want to make a couple of comments, I know I burned up most of the clock, but I wanted to get this all on the record. So, Commissioner O'Reilly.
I can't thank you enough for your leadership on this issue. It's great to be home in Niagara County. Your point is well taken in terms of the $10 million and only receiving back $2 million. So the consumers in my old town are paying for it twice. Not only are they paying the 911 fees that are being diverted, but then they're having to pay higher local residential taxes where the budgets are coming from. And so Niagara County is doing, property taxes went up to fund the extra $8 million shortfall. And so they're being hit twice on this. And New York government has made clear that they have no intention of changing this. Rhode Island has no interest right now in terms of solving their problem. New Jersey has the same problem. I was just talking to some folks from Guam and the same issues. We have some work to do in this front. I would love continuing to work with you on your leadership.
We've shined a light on it. You were very helpful in that. Thank you all for your time today. This is also not a partisan issue whatsoever. So, Madam Chair, I yield.
Public safety issue.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Costello, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to first just say, since I've been on this committee, I've done my best to delve into these issues, and they are very sophisticated, the things that each of you deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I just want to commend each of you for your expertise and the time that you dedicate to our country and to the FCC and to the industry for trying to get it right. And with that, I want to ask Commissioner O'Reilly a question. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the dais today have articulated their interest in giving the FCC more of a presence on cybersecurity issues. While the concern over cybersecurity and supply chain vulnerabilities is certainly well-founded, it's my understanding that the FCC is not and should not play a lead role, I emphasize lead role, on identifying and mitigating these vulnerabilities. The FCC has a long tradition of deferring to expert agencies in the executive branch with the relevant intelligence and national security expertise. For example, the FCC routinely refers applications for transfers of certain licenses to an informal working group in the executive branch known as Team Telecom to review the national security implications of each such transaction. Do you believe the FCC has anything new or unique to add to our nation's cybersecurity work, or do the intelligence and national security agencies currently have a good handle on these issues?
So I have to be careful in terms of what I can say in the public, but I do believe that the authority has been provided by Congress. So it's not my question. It's in the statute. Who the Congress gave authority to was to other agencies besides the FCC on the issue of cybersecurity. And so that is not something that I believe we have great authority to act. If Congress changes that authority, that is one thing. But I do believe that we work well with what is as you referenced, Team Telecom. There is a need to reform Team Telecom, and I've advocated some reforms to that. But I do believe that we do not have the primary role. We do have functions that we can add to that conversation.
And that's why I direct the question. The reforms that you've advocated, does that contemplate that you do have existing expertise that could be lent if the statute was broadened to enable you to do that?
So the changes that I'm seeking is more formal structure for Team Telecom and addressing the timing of decisions that are made by them and making sure that when that interaction between the FCC and Team Telecom actually is beneficial. We have applications that sit at Team Telecom under the last administration for quite a long time period. That's problematic for those that have applied. It doesn't mean we're undermining national security one iota.
Sure.
It means we have a better, efficient government.
So if I were to characterize, while you agree that cybersecurity is a deeply serious issue, you do not feel that placing more jurisdiction within the FCC or having the FCC exercise additional jurisdiction, be it within the statute or broadening the statute, would be well placed because we have existing intelligence agencies that are already fully capable of doing that, and the FCC does not have anything additional to add. Is that correct? Or did I just say too much?
Well, there's a lot to. I would agree with an awful lot what you said. We will continue to have conversations with those entities, but I think that they have a great deal of authority and are capable of providing us the information as it relates to applications that are submitted for our consideration.
Okay, I do have a question for Commissioner Carr, but does anyone have anything to add to that real briefly? Okay. Telehealth. As you're aware, the prospect of telehealth holds exponential benefits for patients, families, and the healthcare system at large. But on the issue of access for rural America, Commissioner Carr, what can we expect to come out of the 3-year pilot program? What sort of job creation can rural communities expect from increased investment in the development of telehealth technologies?
Thanks very much for the question. These are some of the things that we want to tee up in this notice of inquiry that's up for vote. We've seen some great examples of telehealth, remote patient monitoring technologies that have significantly improved outcome for low-income patients, including in rural America, as I mentioned in my testimony in the Mississippi Delta. And we've also seen significant cost savings. That one program that I mentioned in the Mississippi Delta, if just 20% of the diabetic population in the Magnolia State enrolled in that type of a program, it would be projected to save about $189 million in terms of the state's Medicaid expenses.
Okay, so, very good. Anyone else to add on that? Yes.
I'll simply add, and I agree with everything Commissioner Carr said. A few months ago, President Kennedy's first FCC chairman, Newt Minow, and I wrote an op-ed, bipartisan op-ed that emphasized the importance of telemedicine, and Commissioner Carr has expounded these principles very well. But if you look at some of the cases we identified as schools in Scottsville, Kentucky, that for the first time are able to treat students because there's no pediatrician in all of Allen County, Kentucky. If you look at the Veterans Affairs facilities in Lecanto, Florida, and Boise, Idaho, where they're providing veterans mental health consultations with experts around the country. If you look at all of these great things that the FCC is doing in collaboration with the public and private sectors, we could really dramatically improve health outcomes for millions of Americans. And here too, I think we're only scratching the surface of its potential. And that has a direct impact on you as well. And instead of spending a lot of money on, for example, an emergency room visit, if we do proactive health treatments for some of these folks, we can save a lot of money for the system, but more importantly, save lives and improve health outcomes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, seeing that there are no further. Oh, Kinzinger came in. All right.
Bought you guys another 5 minutes. You're welcome. Thank you.
There you go. You are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here and all your service to the country and what you do. And I really appreciate it. I recently reintroduced the FCC Transparency Act, which would require the Commission to publish on its website any documents to be considered and voted upon at least 21 days in advance. In reality, it's simply a codification of the most important aspects of the transparency process currently in place at the FCC. I realize that most of the Commission has weighed in publicly on my bill, but just to have your opinions as part of the record for this, I want to ask each of you, do you support the current transparency processes in place at the FCC, and by extension, do you support the FCC Transparency Act? We'll start with you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely, Congressman. Thank you for your leadership.
Yes, I concur. I agree wholeheartedly with your bill.
Yes and yes. I think it codifies good government, and it's a step in the right direction.
Yes, for items that are placed on our monthly agenda meeting.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Reilly, your actions to roll back the so-called KidVid rules is born out of a recognition that there is so much choice today in terms of children's programming. Whether it's on a tablet, an Apple TV, or Roku, or traditional broadcast TV service, you argue that the government need not mandate specific programming to any one outlet. And to be clear, I support families and children having access to good educational programming, but I do watch some TV, and I'd argue that competition and consumer choice have never been greater, not only for children's programming, but for all audiences. If you don't mind, briefly summarize your assessment of the video marketplace and choices available to consumers.
Well, thank you. I will say I take only issue with the idea of rollback. We are trying to provide greater flexibility on the KidVid issue. As you highlighted, the marketplace has changed incredibly since 1990 when the statute, the Children's Television Act was enacted, in 1996 when the rules by the FCC were put in place, and 2004 when they were modified extensively. So the world has changed. We have a much broader marketplace for children's programming. It's not just your 3 broadcast channels on Saturday morning. It is a plethora of cable options, and it is a ton of options for those over the top. Now, there has been concern, what happens for the family that doesn't have any of that except broadcast television? And we have tried to address that in the NPRM, and I'm going to take comments on giving the opportunity and the flexibility for broadcasters to move that signal that they have on the primary channel today to a multicast channel, so the programming will still be available to those over-the-air only households. So I would argue it's greater flexibility without harming children that we're seeking to do hopefully later this year.
Thank you. Also, as a co-chair of the Bipartisan Rural Broadband Caucus, my colleagues and I have worked diligently to close the digital divide between urban and rural. In the 21st century, broadband access is vital for employers and employees, educators and students, doctors and patients, and in ag. Broadband access also allows people to participate in digital commerce, which provides a convenience to our rural constituents while bolstering both their local economy and the national economy. I'm proud that my provisions and others I supported, including the Rural Spectrum Accessibility Act and the Improving Broadband Access for Veterans Act, were included in the Rayburn Act and signed into law in March. And I'm also proud that my fellow caucus co-chairs and I asked for and received robust resources for rural broadband infrastructure in the FY18 Omni to the tune of $600 million in new money. While our broadband and telecom work continues, we're taking big steps towards ensuring rural Americans have the tools that they need to flourish. So, Commissioner O'Reilly, you focused in your testimony on the various funding streams being allocated towards rural broadband. We all want to bridge the digital divide, but I share your concern about the coordination of funding between agencies. We have to ensure that we're not being redundant with our resources by pouring money into the same areas from different agencies. Do you have ideas on how these agencies can better coordinate and how best to prevent the government from subsidizing the overbuilding of areas that are currently served?
I do, and I'd love to provide technical advice to your team to help, ways that I thought, I really appreciate the efforts and commendable efforts and the work in terms of the pilot program that was created as part of the consolidated appropriations and efforts that are ongoing in the farm bills today. Very beneficial. We wanted to get to exactly what you highlighted, is not the duplication, make sure the speeds do not become a mechanism to overbuild, and I think there's ways to draft that and include in language. It hasn't been adopted as in past efforts. People have asked for language that I provided, didn't quite get there, and I think there's an opportunity to correct that going forward.
And I just, in the last 30 seconds, I'll just make a point versus ask a question, which is on the issue of stingrays or IMSIs, which is, there's been a lot of ink lately about the fact that some of these devices have been located around sensitive areas. We've made multiple requests with multiple agencies about how do we deal with this issue. I would just like to make the point that whether it's FCC or other agencies, really encourage everybody to work together to figure out how to address this situation, because I think it's a concern from a national security perspective and something that ought to be addressed. So with that, Madam Chair, I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and now there are no further members, and we thank you all very much. Before we conclude, I ask unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record: a letter from the Credit Union National Association, a letter from the Utilities Technology Council, a letter to the FCC on 911 fee diversion, a U.S. Telecom blog post, a letter to the FCC on TCPA, a letter from Anthem and its affiliated health plans, a GAO report on Lifeline. Without objection, so ordered. And Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to make unanimous consent to add to the record the letter from wireless ISPs to the FCC regarding the CBRS ban, Chairman Pai's tweet with the CEO of Wave Wireless, an article from Ars Technica regarding the letter and tweet made part of the record, NTIA's letter to the FCC regarding copper retirement, and letter from Senator Wyden to FCC regarding Securus.
Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to committee rules, members are reminded that they have 10 business days in which to submit additional questions, and we remind you that you have 10 business days in which to respond. Seeing no further business to come before the committee is adjourned.